please take your seats so we can get started here. Welcome to day 2 of the Family Formation in the Future conference here at the Danube Institute. It's so lovely to see a full room of enthusiastic people and brilliant minds and dignitaries. So really such an honor to be here, and an honor to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. Balázs András Orbán is a Hungarian lawyer, political scientist, and member of parliament who has been serving as political director of Prime Minister Viktor Orbán since 2021. He is the chairman of the board of Matthias Corvinus Collegium, MCC, Hungary's leading extracurricular educational institution. He also chairs the advisory board of the National University of Public Service and oversees the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Between 2004 and 2012, he studied at the Eötvös Loránd University Faculty of Government and Law and graduated in law and political science. He entered the doctoral school of ELTE in 2009, and he has received his PhD. In 2014, he received an LLM degree in legal regulation and public administration at the Pezsmányi Péter Catholic University Faculty of Law and Political Science. He speaks Hungarian, English, and German. In 2012, he joined and you're going to have to forgive me for my pronunciation. I did take a couple months of Hungarian, but among your many unique and beautiful aspects of this culture, that is just one that is pretty hard for me to grasp. But okay, so in 2012, he joined the Századvég Foundation, a conservative think tank, as a regulatory expert. He became the foundation's research director in 2013, managing and coordinating public law and public policy research until 2018. Between 2016 and 2018, he was a member of the board of that foundation. In 2015, he became the director of the Migration Research Institute. In 2016, he started teaching at the National University of Public Service and has also been teaching at the Matthias Corvinus Collegium since 2015. Between 2018 and 2022, Orbán served as Deputy Minister, Parliamentary and Strategic State Secretary at the Prime Minister's office. Since 2018, he became the chair of the advisory board of the National Public Service University, also being responsible for the development and modernization of the university. And since August 2021, he has been serving as a political director to Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, as I mentioned. As his chief advisor, he supports strategic decision-making and coordinates the work of the Prime Minister's advisors. In 2022, he became member of the Hungarian Parliament. In 2023, he was appointed to oversee the work of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. Balázs Orbán's articles and analyses are frequently published in various online and printed newspapers and journals. He has authored several books, including The Character of the Hungarian State, published in Hungarian and German, The Hungarian Way of Strategy, published in Hungarian, English, French, German, Italian, Polish, and Spanish, and The Hussar Cut, The Hungarian Strategy for Connectivity, published, again, in many languages, this time including Chinese. So, Orbán lives in Budapest with his wife and 2 sons. What a pleasure to have you. Balázs, please.
Give a big applause to Helen, please, and her Hungarian. Anyway, sorry, Helen, but I'm too young for that, so it's a CV which is unnecessary to raise. But good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Life often presents us with 2 equal paths, yet we instinctively choose one over the other. I experience this every time I visit the Buda Castle from the underground parking lot. Sorry, we at the government, we have an underground parking lot. There, I have a choice. Take an elevator to either the first floor or the second. And I always choose the second floor. Rationally, it makes no sense. It's an extra stop that doesn't bring me any closer to my destination. And yet, I always take this route. The reason is very simple, the view. I choose this path because I feel connected to this place. There is nothing unusual about such moments. We all experience them. This sense of longing is deeply human. If we look closer, we realize that our attachments give us direction, shaping both our personal lives and our communities. After all, belonging means that places, people, experiences hold meaning for us. So, dear friends, it might seem a bit unusual at first that I'm sharing all this with you here and now, but I do so to illustrate the main motivation behind the Hungarian government's policies. The Hungarian government has been in power for like 15 years. The Hungarian Prime Minister has been in politics for nearly 40 years. The political right in Hungary has fought many great battles. But when we ask what all these battles are really for, what their deeper meaning or ultimate goal is, we must address fundamental questions about the human conditions. As the examples I mentioned shows, we experience space and time very differently from how scientists describe them. Science tells us that space and time are neutral, the same everywhere. But for us, they are full of meaning, special places, moments, people, our home, the town we grew up in. These are not just locations, but places that matter to us. Celebrations mark special moments. Our family members are not just people, they hold a unique place in our lives. It's this meaning that gives our lives purpose. Meaning equals responsibility. Meaning isn't just a product of rational thought. It runs deeper and gives direction for our rational behavior. Let me explain this and what I mean. As I mentioned, Budakeszi district, truly stunning setting. The Matthias Church, the fisherman's bastion, the breathtaking view. No matter which country we come from, we can all agree that this is actually a beautiful place. But for us, Hungarians, the Buda Castle means much more than that. When we walk through this part of the city, it holds a significance that no modern brick wall, no matter how expertly designed, could ever replace. Under these medieval walls, some of the greatest battles of the Hungarian history were fought. Our ancestors lived and died here. This is the heart of the Hungarian state for like 800 years. There was love, betrayal, murder, acts of bravery, tragedy, and even more moments of glory and joy. All of this meaning brings with it a sense of duty, purpose, and responsibility for us, Hungarians. It reminds us that we must carry the story forward. We have to fight our own battles, and we have to pass this legacy to our children. Meaning equals responsibility, and that gives us our place in the world. Psychologists claim this sense of meaning and purpose often emerge in moments of optimal stress, times when we feel both stable and challenged. These moments push us to grow, discover new abilities, and make important choices. They help us distinguish right from wrong and shape our sense of purpose. From all these perspectives, one thing stands out. Meaning and purpose are deeply connected to our relationship with the world and others. Meaning and purpose don't come from isolation. They can't exist if we don't value our surroundings, hometown, family, community, or nation. It's these connections that drive us towards meaningful experiences. They lead us into challenges where under just the right amount of pressure, we grow and become more than we were before. To sum it up, we find meaning and purpose when we take responsibility for others. This responsibility leads us into situations that help us grow. It also allows us to develop successful, future-focused strategies. Ultimately, meaning and purpose are deeply tied to relationships. We must nurture our connections with the Word and those around us to truly experience them. So, ladies and gentlemen, with this in mind, let me turn to the political side of the remarks. The world is undergoing major changes, including in geopolitics. Many describe this as a decline or ongoing collapse of the liberal universalist world order, making way for a new multipolar sovereignist one. But these challenges aren't just geopolitical. They also involve shifts of ideas. New perspectives are emerging from outside the Western world, and even within the West, ideas are changing rapidly. We have begun to rediscover one of the very first commandments in Scripture: be fruitful and increase in numbers, multiply on earth and increase upon it. What the Bible teaches us is also true in geopolitics. Liberal values alone are not enough. The size of a community matters. Its market strength, military power are crucial. These are truths that haven't changed over time. Of course, we can say that God loves and blesses small nations as well, and that's true. But even small nations needs a stable population. It needs the next generation. Small nations must be able to renew itself from where they were. It's existential from that point of view. In the past few decades, the Western world has forgotten these basic truths. For the past 80 years, Western civilization has been built on the assumption that liberal values are universal, that they should apply everywhere in the same way for everyone. But as a result, liberalism has drained meaning and purpose from our lives. Just an example, I once read a postmodern parenting blog that said bedtime is a colonial construct. I stopped reading it immediately. Liberal values have weakened our sense of right and wrong, our expectations for the future, and our ability to navigate the world. The real crisis isn't just that liberal values have failed globally, they have failed at home. Instead of strengthening Western societies, they have contributed to their decline. Of course, for some of you, none of this is new. There were people who saw this coming and warned us about the dangers. Many Americans, many Anglo-Saxons, but also many Europeans. Famous German constitutional scholar Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde pointed this out as early as the 1970s. He showed that the state built purely on liberal principles cannot reproduce the very values it is based on. Values like human dignity, the freedom derived from it, equality before the law, all of these are the results of an organic historical development. Their roots lie in the moral foundations in Europe of a Judeo-Christian civilization. If we throw away the historical grounding, liberal values can no longer function as they were meant to. In the end, the state based solely on liberal ideas becomes self-defeating. Its days are numbered. So we see the consequences everywhere. In Western societies, families, nations are under strain. Liberals insisted that attachment to home and country wasn't necessary for a successful society. This was the logic behind their migration policy as well, which led to mass illegal migration. But reality proved otherwise. Our homeland matter. If the shared meaning that holds a society together disappears, the society itself collapses. The effects are clear: rising crime, internal unrest in the society, security threats everywhere in many Western countries. The same pattern applies to the family. Liberals argued the family can be basically anything. It's not made up for father, mother, and children. They even had a slogan for this in Hungary, which said, "Family is family," which is a clear tautology. It suggests that no one really knows what family means. But family isn't an abstract concept. It's about deep personal attachment. It teaches us cooperation, sacrifice, and how to live together. Unlike the liberal idea of a state as a social contract, the family comes first. It is the foundation of the society itself. Strong families build strong nations. Nations are bound by shared history, geography, traditions, and our attachment to them often starts at home. When liberals weakened family values, they weakened their own nations. And now the West is paying the price. Birth rates are plummeting. Last year, births in the EU dropped by almost 6%, the biggest decline in 60 years. The lesson is clear. Societies cannot thrive without strong families, without strong national identities. These values bring meaning to our life. The West must rediscover these foundations if it hopes to remain strong in the future. Western countries have only one path forward: the return to the traditional values that liberals abandoned. We must strengthen families, rebuild local communities, revive patriotism, and restore national identity. Only with these foundations we can secure our future. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, Hungary recognized early on the danger of relying only on liberal values. This is why the Hungarian parliament adopted the new constitution spring of 2011. The fundamental law has been in force since 2012, and it brought a real shift in thinking, one that could serve as an example for the entire Western world. That makes the Hungarian constitution truly unique. What makes the Hungarian constitution truly unique is that it brings the values of our historical constitution into the modern constitutional framework. In doing so, it turns the story of a Hungarian legal development and, in a broader sense, the history of Hungary itself, into a shared reference point for our community. Therefore, it brings back meaning and purpose into how the Hungarian state operates. The fundamental law also reminds us of something essential. Freedom doesn't work without community. As the famous Sir Roger Scruton, who is greatly admired in Hungary, put it, we need a bond between past generations, those living today, and the ones who will come after us. This is exactly as it is, as a text it is in a Hungarian constitution. This is why in Hungary, human dignity and sanctity of family and the nation's cause can be protected as a constitutional value, all at the same time. And these values have become the foundation of our most important policy decisions ever since. For nearly 15 years, we have worked hard to strengthen families, support local communities, and restore national pride. Yesterday, fellow cabinet minister, Minister Hanko, spoke about the specific policies we have implemented. So instead, repeating his point, I briefly summarize what we have done and the results what we achieved. Hungary has structured its entire state, politics, and economy around families. We believe that the family is the foundation and must be supported at all levels. The goal is very simple: help those who want to start a family and raise children. Full stop. Hungarian women and mothers are our partners in this effort. That's why Hungary is unique. A woman here may never have to pay personal income tax ever again. Young people under 25 pay no income tax. Mothers under 30 with one child and mothers over 30 with 2 children or more also under the zero income tax policy. And we didn't stop there. In Hungary, for a woman who decides to have a child, she gets 3 years of maternity leave. And during this time, she's entitled to higher salary than what she earned in her job before. I won't list every policy we have introduced is more than 30. But these examples show our core principles. Supporting families is the key to a strong society, and it must be seen in your everyday policy decisions as well. These policies have led us real, measurable success. We are not satisfied. We still have a lot of things to do, but there are real, measurable success points. Since our government came to power, the number of marriages has gone up by a third. Since 2010, number of divorces involving children has dropped by 80%. In the same period, number of abortions has been cut in half, and this happened without changing anything in the regulation. Hungary now has the third highest fertility rate in the EU, behind only France and Bulgaria. In 2010, we had the lowest. Without our family policies, 212,000 fewer children would have been born. This would be the population of 212,000 people. This would be the second largest city in Hungary. We have doubled the number of daycare centers, making childcare accessible in 3.5 times more towns than before. So we are also committed to preserving rural life and making it an attractive option for families. Invested heavily in infrastructure renovation in small towns, ensured rural communities have access to quality service so people don't need to force to move to big cities. Promoted Hungary's beautiful countryside, strengthening the bond between people and their homeland. For our American guests, rural Hungary is almost like Midwest, but with better wine and fewer tornadoes. So you see how promoting machinery works in Hungary. So Hungary is also known for its strong stance on illegal migration. We see this as an essential part of protecting our largest national community, the nation. We have spent almost 2 billion on border protection, and we build the fence ourselves. No supply chain issues, no congressional hearings, just hammers and resolve. Brussels, so the European institutions, didn't just oppose this initiative and the fence itself, but now fines us €1 million per day for defending our borders. At some point, I start to wonder if they are so jealous of our border friends. It's something in the EU that actually works. But we stand firm and will reclaim every cent that has been unfairly taken from us. But even with this fine, it still makes more sense to pay €1 million a day than to let in all those illegal immigrants Brussels wants to force on us. As a wrap-up, I want to reaffirm Hungary's commitment, supporting families, strengthening communities, and defending national identity. Over the past 15 years, we have made families as the foundation of our society and economy, believing that strong families can lead us to a strong nation. We will continue to focus on this in the future. Today, families face a number of challenges, including demographic decline, cultural shift, economic pressures. I can't think of a better place than Hungary and the platform provided by the Danube Institute to discuss these challenges and these issues. Here at the Danube, I'm also happy to see that our conservative refugee program works very well, and we have a lot of people here. Now America is getting a little bit more promising, but in Europe, actually Budapest is still the ultimate safe space for conservative thinking, so it's very good to see so many like-minded people and good to spend time together and learn from each other. And I hope our experiences can provide inspiration and practical solution for our countries, all of our countries as well. Take this opportunity, please, to share ideas, engage, open discussions, collaborate on strengthening families worldwide. And please feel free to speak openly. Hungary is a family-friendly country. We like to think of it as one big extended family. And in a family, the greatest virtue is honesty. Sometimes it hurts, but it works. Thank you for the attention, and I wish you a productive and enjoyable conference.
And it's a great pleasure to introduce the moderator for the panel, Simon Hankinson from the Heritage Foundation. Simon Hankinson is a senior research fellow in the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation. He writes and speaks on immigration, foreign policy, and other issues both at Heritage and in various national media outlets. Simon writes the weekly Borderline column for the Daily Signal. From 1999 to 2023, Hankinson was a Foreign Service officer serving in India, Fiji, Ghana, Slovakia, Togo, Washington, D.C., Marseille, and Nairobi. Prior to entering the State Department, he worked as a lawyer in London and then taught history, English, and drama at a private school in Miami. I didn't know that drama part. That's pretty cool. Hankinson holds an MA in Modern History from St. Andrews, Scotland, and a law degree from the College of Law in London, and an MA in International Security Affairs from the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Simon? Oh, there you are. Hi. Oh, sorry, I thought you were sitting down. Nice to see you. You can go ahead and stand where you and just make sure that you mention. Do you need a program?
Oh, good morning, everybody. We have two difficulties with this panel. One is that it's 3 o'clock in the morning for me, but I've fortified with some coffee. And the other is that we have too many smart people. So I'm not going to give you their long biographies because they're in the pamphlet that you have. I'm just simply going to say that Heather McDonald is one of the people that I read every single thing she writes. Her latest, maybe not her latest book, The Diversity Delusion, is on my desk with a highlighter pen in it because I'm using it for something I'm writing now. She is an expert on crime, but has written on immigration and so many other things. You're going to learn a lot today. Mark Krikorian is the godfather of immigration studies. I've been reading him since before I was in university. We also have today Daniel Whitehead, and Theo Wald, two, I would say, rising jurists, because they're younger than me, who have clerked for federal judges, both affiliated with think tanks, I think the Claremont Institute at the moment, and the Hungary Institute for Mr. Whitehead. And then we have Juan Gomez visiting from the University of Navarre, who can bring some perspective from Spain, which has a very different immigration take than some of these other countries. I'll take the prerogative here, since I guess we're all going to come and sit in the chairs, and why don't we do that? And I'll just, thank you. And I'll just set it up very quickly before I introduce everyone with a quick question and then let them speak as long as they like on that topic, as long as it's no more than 10 or 15 minutes, I've been told, so we can get everybody in. But I keep a running log as an immigration scholar of events in Europe and other places, and when I was looking at crime and how it impacts immigration, I had a few notes down country by country. Now, in the United States, and I'm hoping Mark can talk more about this, we are always told this myth that immigrants commit no crimes, far fewer crimes than natives, they work much harder, pay more taxes, as if there's absolutely no cost to mass migration, legal and illegal. This is not true. This is a statistical game that is always played. The reality is we've let in millions of people in the last 4 years in particular who tend to skew younger and male, and are lower skilled, and so in every sense are adding costs to our society that people have a right to understand. We have over 8 million people on our non-detained docket, that is, people who are in removal, deportation proceedings, who should be detained under our law, but there's obviously no space, and so they're left to run free and to work and enjoy their lives. And most of them we have absolutely no tabs on. We don't know where they are. Then when I go around the world, I look country by country. You see in Belgium, they have crime coming in from Marseille, where I was consul general briefly, from Morocco, as well as their own native crime to deal with. I won't go into too many statistics. In Denmark, the violent crime from particular countries in the Middle East, the rate is 7 times that of among native Danes. And one interesting study I read about from Denmark of 321 refugees from Palestine admitted from whatever the area that is known as Palestine, and I want to get onto that today. In 1992, they found that 30 years later, 64% had been convicted of crimes, 34% of their children had criminal records, and about half of them were living on welfare. So different populations come with different baggage, let's say, different costs, and that needs to be considered by the host country. Across the European Union, each 1 percentage point increase in immigrant population is associated with a 3.6% increase in the homicide rate. In France, in the first half of 2022, foreign nationals committed 70% of violent robberies. Germany, I could devote an entire book to, but I'm hoping that Heather's going to cover that since she wrote a very interesting piece on this recently. But the statistics are quite troubling. The gang rapes have gone up from about 300 in 2018 to over almost 700 in 2021, and I think I'm not sure what the statistics were last year. But as is typical of German crime statistics, the foreign-born population is about 15%, but their percentages of arrestees and as suspects in crimes, particularly violent crimes, are much, much higher, around 40%. That's also true of the Netherlands. Hungary, it's a very short entry. If you Google, crime, it's a very short thing. All I find is that they're being fined $1 million a day, as Mr. Orban just said, for refusing to follow the European migration sharing regime. Italy, Algerian immigrants alone were suspects in crime 17 times more than native Italians. In the Netherlands, as I said, non-Western immigrants were 14% of the population, but committed 40% of all crime. And migrants from what they call the North Africa, Middle East, were arrested 2 to 4 times the rate of native Dutch for certain crimes. Sweden is now Europe's highest gun homicide rate. 63% of convicted rapists in Sweden are first or second generation migrants. Immigrants counted for 73% of cases of manslaughter and 84% of assault rape. So these are statistics that you would not have seen in Sweden a generation or two ago, and they are social costs that have to be considered by politicians. And I would just note before I finish that these are having political consequences. We're seeing parties that are against mass migration, particularly illegal migration, doing better and better, but at the same time their politicians are being disqualified from running in elections, which is a troubling issue. And terrifying for Americans is that people who speak out against this are being arrested and sometimes prosecuted. In Germany, one politician who pointed out that there was a disproportionate level of crime among people from certain countries in Germany, this is just a fact, a statistic, was actually fined, convicted by a German court. And in England, free speech is I would say, under threat. So I would like to ask Heather McDonald to start us off, perhaps by talking about her research on crime in the United States and New York City in particular, and perhaps tying it in with some of her recent findings on Germany. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's an extraordinary honor to be back in Budapest, and this conference has been extraordinary. The people, the caliber of thinking, and the iconoclasm here has been simply breathtaking. Helen had asked me to speak about the reality of crime in the United States and its effect on families. I'm going to turn the question around and talk about the effect of families on crime. Until now, the conference has stressed the commonalities across the Western world with Europe, America with the dropping fertility rates, but I'm going to speak about American exceptionalism, the way that I think America is quite different than what you have experienced in Hungary, not in a good way. And I apologize for starting with numbers this early in the morning, but without them, it's a little hard to grasp the dimension of the differences that I'm talking about. In 2023, according to data that I could find on the web, and maybe Mr. Orban would have something differently, Hungary had 70 homicide cases. That's 1 every 5 days. In 2022 in the U.S., which is the last year for which we have fully available data, there were 24,849 homicide cases, or 68 a day. Well, maybe this is just a function of our very large population in the United States, but if you look at the victimization rate for homicide, In Hungary, it's 0.77 per 100,000 people. And in the US, it's 7.7 per 100,000. So if Hungary had the US homicide rate, you'd have 700 homicides a year instead of 70. But these numbers, I'm going to dig into them a little bit further. And if I were in the US, we've heard about safe spaces, I would issue a trigger warning right now. I'm going to talk about something that most Americans would not prefer to talk about, that make people very uncomfortable. And I'm also, let me just preface this, I'm talking about group averages. I'm not talking about any individual. You cannot make any judgments about any individual based on the average characters of his group. But that having been said, the group averages I'm talking about here are key to what's going on in the United States right now with regards to crime and law enforcement. So while the national homicide rate in America was 7.7 per 100,000, the homicide victimization rate for blacks in 2022 was 29 per 100,000, or 4 times the overall national rate. The white homicide victimization rate was 4.2 per 100,000, so the black homicide rate was 7 times that of the white rate. While blacks are only a little over 13% of the US population, they make up 54% of all homicide victims. 36 blacks a day die of homicide in the United States. The black homicide victimization rate is 37.6 times higher than Hungary's overall national homicide rate. If Hungary had the black homicide victimization rate, you'd have 2,632 homicide victims a year, or 7 a day, not 1 every 5 days. But these numbers alone don't even tell the full story of US violent crime. The overwhelming majority of homicides in the US are gun deaths. Black juveniles die of shootings at the rate of 9 per 100,000. The black juvenile gun homicide rate is 9 times higher than white juveniles. And what do these drive-by shootings look like? They happen overwhelmingly in urban, that's a euphemism, neighborhoods, and they're barbaric and mindless. A teenager sprays bullets towards a car, across a sidewalk, or into a home because he feels dissed by somebody, likely a fellow gang member. This reckless disregard for life routinely results in toddlers being shot through the head, 9-year-olds being shot while playing in their backyard, sitting on their front porch, or sleeping in their beds. Now, because of such crime disparities, the US prison population is also racially disproportionate. Though blacks are 13% of the population, they are about a third of the incarcerated population. That disproportion drives everything about the criminal justice system in the United States today. For the last half century, the only allowable explanation for disparities in the criminal justice system with regards to contact with the police, arrests, convictions, and incarceration, the only allowable explanation has been systemic racism. If blacks are stopped, arrested, and prosecuted, imprisoned at a higher rate than whites, the only allowable explanation is that the police are racist, prosecutors are racist, the laws are racist, judges are racist. No one was allowed to say that there is actually disparate rates of criminal offending underlying these disparities in the criminal justice system. But the bodies don't lie. The gold standard for all criminal data is homicide data. Nobody's making up those dead black bodies or hiding white black bodies. The differences that we see in incarceration reflects actual differences in criminal offending. Black juveniles die of gun homicide at 9 times the rate of white juveniles, and they're not being killed by whites, as you would have us believe by the Black Lives Matter movement or by the police they're being killed at that rate, if not higher, by other blacks. And such crime disparities happen across all categories of crime, all categories of violent crime and property crime. So instead of admitting these realities, again, we turn our eyes away. We've been shutting down the criminal justice system in the United States in order to avoid exacerbating a disparate impact on black criminals. Prosecutors in liberal cities, New York, where I come from, LA, where I'm from originally, San Francisco, Chicago, Philadelphia, they've declared whole categories of crime off limits, essentially decriminalizing a range of criminal behavior. They're no longer prosecuting fare beating, which means jumping a turnstile or getting on a bus and not paying your fare, trespass, drug possession, disorderly conduct, shoplifting, and here's what is extremely inimical to civilization, resisting arrest. You know, you resist a police officer with impunity, and it's over. Society is over. Because if you did enforce those laws and prosecute them, you would have a disparate impact on black criminals. We've decided that it's better to let a criminal go free than to put another black criminal in prison. Shoplifting has gotten so bad in New York City and other cities that innocuous items like toothpaste or calcium supplements are behind lock and key. We lock up the toothpaste, we don't lock up the criminals who steal it. So to buy a bottle of aspirin, you have to press a button and hope that a clerk shows up in maybe 5 minutes to unlock the plexiglass barrier that the aspirin is behind. Not surprisingly, a lot of shoppers have just decided to get heck with retail shopping, I'm buying everything online. Restaurants have closed down, drugstores have closed down, department stores have closed down because they cannot afford the shoplifting cost. This leads to a death spiral in cities as more and more retail establishments go out of business and the cityscape becomes less and less inviting. Now, Helen also asked me to talk about how the disparate impact affects schooling. Under Presidents Barack Obama and Joe Biden, the assumption, similar to what we've already talked about, the disparate impact assumption was that if black students have higher rates of school discipline, it must be because their teachers are racist. Well, this is facially implausible because there's no more liberal profession in the country than teaching. Education school in the United States is one 2-year marination in critical race theory, white privilege theory. I can guarantee you that teachers are not arbitrarily disciplining black students out of some racial animus. And you would also think that if we knew that black juveniles are committing gun homicide, say, at 9 to 10 times the rates of other groups, that the same lack of socialization that leads to that astronomical violent crime rate would show up in the classroom as well. Somebody who's committing, gang crimes and robberies and at school after hours is not in school obsequiously obeying his teacher and paying attention in class. And I've indeed observed inner city classrooms that I think would just astound a Hungarian. The insubordination, students with their backs to the teacher, the headphones on, getting up, walking around in class, and, as Helen wanted me to talk about, beating up teachers, assaulting them for daring to exercise any kind of discipline, which has led to a flight from the profession. And classroom chaos has increased because under the Biden administration and the Obama administration, schools that still had disparate rates of discipline were sued by the federal government for civil rights violations. The only way they could get out from under the federal boot would be to bring their discipline rates equal, which meant not disciplining at all. And you can imagine what that resulted in. Now, so the ongoing disintegration of school order does lead to white flight. Parents leave cities for suburbs. Within cities, the most liberal progressive parents do everything they can I'm going to speak very honestly here. They would never say this, but this is exactly what's going on, to not send their kids to school with blacks, either in the majority or the minority. And so they have to pay very, very high tuition costs for New York's fancy private schools. Dalton, one of the most well-known, this is through K through 12, so it's pre-college. Tuition there costs $64,300 a year, which is 24 million Hungarian forints each year. So you can imagine the mothers are, whether they will it or not, they're working 12 hours a day writing interrogatories so they can afford this. And a frequent sight in my neighborhood on the Upper East Side around school let-out time is children in their school uniforms being pushed along by third world nannies. And I marvel at this decision that a mother would rather spend her time making partner because she has to compete with males, you understand, and show that she's their equal, and would contract out the miracle of watching her child change on a daily basis and acquire language, that's something she feels her comparative advantage is writing interrogatories in a corporate asbestos tort litigation and not enriching her child's vocabulary. But that's the way it looks in my neighborhood. So what's the explanation for America's high crime rates? And this is where I return to our topic today. There's many possible ones, and some are more taboo than others. But the big explanation is family breakdown. And the American family is in a much more parlous state than Hungary. And the problem is not so much, when it comes to crime, low birth rates, but birth rates out of wedlock. 40% of all births in the United States are to single mothers. Among blacks, it's a disastrous 69%. Among whites, it's 27%. Among Asians, it's 12%. And among Hispanics, it's 53%. If you want to understand Asian success, Asians are just whooping everybody's ass in the United States when it comes to education, including Jews. They've displaced Jews on the totem pole of academic achievement. Look at their family structure and look at the involvement of their parents in their children's schooling. But this black rate of 69%, that's civilizational catastrophe. You cannot raise young, law-abiding black males with an endless series of boyfriends going through the home. In 1965, one of our great public intellectuals, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, he was a senator, he was an aide to Richard Nixon, he was a piercing thinker. He wrote a report, he was commissioned to write a report on the state of called then the Negro family. And Moynihan delivered very sobering news. He said, up to 65, we've made some civil rights progress. We've had our civil rights laws. We've begun to shrink some of the gaps. But it's all going to come to a halt because the black family breakdown is so bad. Without fathers and responsible males in black children's lives, they're going to stop the progress. What did Moynihan think was a catastrophic level of family breakdown that would end black progress? 23%. It's now 69%. Moynihan would have nothing to say about this. Crime and family breakdown are closely related, but the problem here again is not lack of children, it's lack of fathers. Young males from single-parent households have an incarceration rate that is 79% higher than young males from two-parent households. Other social maladies are associated with family breakdown: school failure, drug use, becoming a single parent oneself, mental problems. And why is that? As everybody knows, especially you people with 6 and 7 children, raising children is difficult. It's hard enough with two parents. And, the left, to extent it would ever acknowledge the role of two parents, would make it all about economics. And indeed, you have you have kin networks, maybe you have two incomes. I would prefer you had one and a stay-at-home mother. but you do have more resources. But the key is not financial capital, it's social capital. You have complementary ways of parenting, you have kinship networks. If we were to conduct a Rawlsian, experiment ab initio and decide who do you want to be born to as a child, you can choose it. A married parent with a $20,000 income or a single mother with $50,000 in welfare benefits, choose the $20,000 married parent income. That is your key to success. So when it comes to crime, I'm much less concerned about the birth rate per se than I am about the lack of fathers. If single mothers started having more children, that would not be a good thing. We've got the children, what we need is the fathers. So we need to revitalize marriage above all else, and that means breaking more taboos. We have got to break the strong women feminist taboo that mothers can do it all and that fathers are appendages. They are luxuries that maybe you add on afterwards. We have to say that the children are best with their biological mothers and fathers. This is something that has become taboo, not just because of the tyranny of feminism, but frankly also because of the LGBTQ lobby. Because if you say that, you are going to diss the lesbian mothers, and we are very polite people, and we're not willing to do that. Building the black family is going to be even harder. I don't want to harp on this race topic, but I will just again give you a little nugget of insight about what U.S. society looks like. The relationship between men and women in the black community is very toxic, and it's been that way for generations. If you listen to rap music, you hear the misogyny. There's a lot of anger in black females towards black males. So it's easy to wave the wand and say, just get married, but that's going to be hard to do. So in conclusion, when it comes to the fertility rate, I don't think crime is the main driver of it. A small percentage of Americans actually live in urban areas. White suburban parents, frankly, face zero violent crime risk. The drive-by shootings are not happening in white neighborhoods. The parents are worried about school shootings, these mass shootings that get a lot of attention. That, frankly, is another delusion. The chances of that happening are very, very slight. They're true, as we heard from our panel yesterday with Tim and others. There is this safetyist obsession of not letting your children out, but that's more for, again, a phantom fear of child abduction than the types of urban crime we're seeing. And blacks, frankly, do bear the brunt of crime. It has not affected their fertility rates. So I don't think that there's a really close connection there. Nevertheless, let me just conclude by saying public order is an end in itself. Government's fundamental role is to safeguard property, life, and the rule of law. There is no civil society where property is secure, where property is insecure. Business owners, people engaged in commerce have to have the security of their possessions. There needs to be consequences for crime. In the U.S., as we have the opposite of Hungary. We have the great inversion. Government has decided that its loyalty is owed to the antisocial, the dysfunctional, and the lawless. And the law-abiding bourgeois citizens are just ATMs for the welfare state to redistribute money into feckless social programs. Fear may have contributed to the birth drop, but it's more likely fear for the fate of the planet than drive-by shootings. So the answers, I think, that have been given at this conference already to the drop in fertility we've seen across the West that are more plausible are prosperity, choice, feminism, and I would add the West's particular and undeserved self-loathing. Thank you very much.
Jura Geld. That was for for Helen. That's the extent of my Hungarian. And just since I think this is a requirement now, I have 3 children. Republican Congressman, then Congressman Steve King, in 2017, shortly after President Trump's inauguration the first time, said, quote, "We can't restore our civilization with someone else's babies," unquote. It seems almost quaint today to say that he got in a lot of trouble for that. He was stripped of his committee assignments. He was eventually challenged in a primary and was voted out of Congress. Now, I kind of know Steve King a little bit, and this was not a racial essentialist comment on his part. Obviously, immigration can supplement a healthy society if it's run prudently, if numbers are low, if there are strict selection criteria, if there's muscular enforcement of the law, aggressive assimilation policies. But immigration cannot be a substitute for having your own babies. Otherwise, what happens is not restoring your civilization, but displacing it with someone else's civilization. But an upcoming report that my Center for Immigration Studies we're going to be releasing next week. It's cis.org. There's a donate button for anybody who's interested there. We're a 501c3, and it's tax deductible, assuming you pay taxes. This was done by my colleagues, and it demonstrates that even if somehow it were possible to restore your civilization with someone else's babies, our immigration policy doesn't really do that. Even now, does not fundamentally change the basic trajectory of lower birth rates. The United States has a record level of immigration, literally never, it's unprecedented. Obviously, the number of foreign-born is bigger because our population is bigger. We have close to 60 million immigrants now in the United States. But even the percentage of immigrants is unprecedented. It's now close to 16%, which is the highest level in the United States ever recorded, even during the Ellis Island period, which ended a century ago last year with the 1924 immigration law. Now, for some small countries, that may not seem that remarkable, but for the United States, this is an unprecedented level of immigration. And in fact, that level of immigration, even lower than that, resulted in legislation a century ago to end the flow of immigrants. But all of that having been said, it has a tiny impact on the total fertility rate. I don't want to go into too much detail. Total fertility rate is kind of a demographic artifact. It's the number of children the statistically average woman would have during her lifetime, given the current trends. And in the United States, our total fertility rate, according to a large Census Bureau survey, the CIA World Factbook I looked up was slightly different, but it's almost the same. We found the total fertility rate in 2023 was 1.8 per woman. If you take the immigrants out and only look at the total fertility rate for the native born, it's 1.73. So all of that enormous, unprecedented level of immigration has raised our total fertility rate by 0.08 babies. In other words, 8/100ths of one baby. So like maybe a hand and part of the forearm. That's it. Now, the reason for this is that the fertility rate of immigrants is somewhat higher than that of natives, but not that much higher. And the United States obviously already has a large population. The denominator is very large, so even a very high level of immigration, and we take in over 1 million immigrants every year, just can't affect that much. And interestingly, the fertility rate for immigrants over the previous 15 years from our study, from 2008 to 2023, the fertility rate for immigrants has fallen faster than it has for the native born because declining fertility is a universal phenomenon. There's only a handful of places where it's not happening. Sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, and Yemen, I think, are about it. Every place else, fertility, I mean, Mexican fertility is now below that of the United States. And this is a phenomenon happening everywhere in the world, not just in the developed world. There's a basic issue here that, I'm not qualified to go into, but it seems pretty clear that modernity is incompatible with having children, that in a sense modernity may well be a self-canceling phenomenon. But be that as it may, the fact is that the immigration is not succeeding in keeping our fertility rate particularly high. But it's even worse than that, because even that small increase, that 8/100ths of a baby, is probably totally canceled out by the effect immigration has on reducing birth rates among the native-born. This is something that doesn't get discussed very much. It hasn't been examined in great detail, so there are various sort of data points, plot points, but the picture seems pretty clear. Now, part of the reason for that is probably economic, and specifically housing costs, because multiple studies over multiple countries clearly show that immigration increases housing costs, and higher housing costs reduce fertility. And in fact, there was a study specifically of Miami, South Florida, in the wake of the Mariel boat lift. This was in 1980. It was an act of a weapon of mass migration, as it were, loosed upon the United States by Fidel Castro, where 120,000 Cubans, literally in a couple of weeks, showed up all at once in Florida. And what the study found is that it significantly reduced native-born fertility, especially among women who lived in rental housing. So the point being, less skilled, poorer women were the ones whose fertility was reduced by increased immigration. Also, and this is interesting, immigration does seem to reduce fertility because it increases diversity. There was a working paper last year, which is a play on the motto of the United States, E pluribus unum, which is from the many one. The title of the working paper was, and pardon me if I pronounce it in classical Latin and not church Latin, E pluribus pauciores, from the many fewer. And the point and the finding was that diversity, we looked at it since 1970, which is when the effects of the 1965 immigration law changes really were taking effect, that since 1970, diversity seems to be responsible for from 20 to 44% of the decline in the birth rate. And the author of the report argues that it's because of homophily, in other words, the tendency people have to want to find partners with people of their own group, however you define that. And that increased diversity makes that increasingly difficult. And in fact, this is something that the Harvard scholar Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone, talked about in another report that he released in an obscure journal because he didn't want anybody to notice it. He just had to publish it. That diversity doesn't just cause people to withdraw to their own groups, whatever that group would be. In other words, it's not Yugoslavia that ends up being created. Rather, increased diversity causes less civic engagement of all kinds with regard to anybody. And that seems to be having an effect not just in all kinds of other areas, civic areas and political areas, but also even in birth rates. And in fact, in the report we're going to release next week, we looked at the correlation between the foreign-born share of the population in large metro areas and the birth rates, births per thousand, sort of a simpler thing to calculate than TFR. And there was a strong correlation. The higher the immigrant share of a metro area, the lower birth rates were. Now, as I said, fertility is down almost everywhere, and it has many causes. This is not something just driven by immigration, but immigration does contribute to it in many cases, but not everywhere. Korea has the lowest fertility in the world, and there's no immigrants there. So this isn't some kind of silver bullet, one-size-fits-all issue. But clearly, not only does immigration contribute to lower fertility, substituting immigrants for babies reduces the urgency, the social and political urgency, to address all of the other issues that are contributing to lower birth rates. And ultimately, using immigration as a substitute for having babies is a kind of Ponzi scheme. To close out with an adaptation of something Margaret Thatcher said, she had said the problem with socialism is that eventually you run out of other people's money. Well, to apply that insight here, the problem with using immigration as a substitute for having babies is that eventually you run out of other people's people. We need, as a species, to grapple with this reality that modernity and healthy birth rate seem to be incompatible, and we need to address it. Immigration cannot fix it, arguably makes it worse, and is a way of avoiding grappling with the deeper problems that are manifested through falling fertility. Thanks for your attention. And
okay. I'm reminded of a story my grandpa used to tell me about a Department of Agriculture bureaucrat who went to a dinner of the Texas cattlemen way out in central Texas. And the bureaucrat told a story about the need to import Brazilian beef into the United States, and how well the Argentine cattlemen were doing with manure management, and how good the marbling of Japanese beef really was. And as he was talking, he noticed, now we're in Texas in this story, right? He noticed that a number of the people in the audience were unholstering their guns. And he came back and he sat next to the president of the Cattlemen's Association, and he said, "I'm getting the feeling that your audience doesn't like me. Should I be afraid?" And the president of the Cattlemen's Association said, "No, we're civilized people around here. You're our guest, but I sure as hell wouldn't want to be the person who invited you." Many thanks to Helen. This is my first visit to Budapest, and thank you for the invitation. So anything I say here this afternoon is her fault. Look, we know that the West is facing a birth dearth, and with it a looming economic crisis, exacerbated by social welfare programs that depend on workers paying into a system, a socialist system, supporting older workers at the end of their lives. Often, immigration is put forward as the solution to that problem. The proponents of mass immigration will say lots of things justifying this. One of the best examples I can give you is from former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, the brother of the former president. Jeb Bush said way back in 2016 at the start of his own presidential campaign, quote, "Immigrants are more fertile, and they love families more than Americans. They bring a younger population, and immigrants, they are the real engine of economic prosperity." Now, more recently, an IMF report published in 2022 said, quote, "The bottom line is that only immigration can ensure population stability or growth in the aging advanced economies of the West. And this will only happen if we promote forward-looking immigration policies that allow larger numbers of immigrants. The argument, as you all probably know, is essentially that immigrants are an economic necessity, that they are the only cure for the labor crisis facing the West. As Ursula von der Leyen said recently, she's kind of like queen of Europe, right? That the, quote, aging advanced economies of Western Europe need to consider the long-run impact of immigration. But she called the cost of immigration only, quote, only political. Is that so? Only political. I'd like to explore, quickly if we can, 3 costs of immigration. Some of them Mark mentioned a moment ago. Cost to education, housing, and job opportunities for native-born citizens. On education, in the United States, we really don't do education very well to begin with. But in the places where education is successful, there are strong community ties, either created by self-selection in the private school setting, as Heather mentioned, where like-minded families of similar socioeconomic status come together to privately pay for education at a particular school that shares their values or their faith commitments, or created by small community, small town accountability, as where a public school, especially in rural America, is closely held and supported by families. Now, immigration disrupts this. In the United States, we've allowed large numbers of migrants to bring their school-aged children to enter our public school system, often with little to no English language ability. The opportunity for an American education lifts up the children of immigrants, but at the expense of classmates, native-born classmates, as classroom time is then allocated to remediating the newcomers' deficiencies, and resources are then expended to hire all of the supporting structure that's needed to mitigate language. Coordinators, translators, social services, free food, and in some instances, housing supplements. It's true also in housing. Housing competition in the United States is now extreme, with prices rising steeply over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, concurrently with an influx of tens of millions of illegal aliens. So unsurprisingly, housing more than 51 million immigrants causes pressures on the domestic housing supply. Who would have thought? Home prices in the United States have skyrocketed, making homes now unaffordable for working Americans in 80% of the United States. And in more than half of the United States, even in places like where I'm from, Idaho or Montana, the states you don't even know about, home prices are now accelerating faster than wages. And then on job opportunities, low-skilled immigrant workers compete primarily with low-income native-born workers. And those native-born workers then suffer disproportionately from the effects of mass immigration. Low-income native-born workers in America suffer almost a 1% drop in income for every 1% increase in the immigrant composition of their industry. So that brings me to something we've heard a lot at this conference over the last day and a half, that the importance of promoting family formation is not purely economic. I agree. And I'd like to give voice to what I think is the purpose of forming large families. But first, let me ask this. What is the telos of the family? Asking this question, I hope, reveals something that we have not yet discussed here at this conference. For as Aristotle held, the household is a school of virtue, where the rearing and raising of children gives rise to future citizens. Humans are social, political creatures. And so the telos of the family, of the domestic sphere, is toward the polity, the wider political community. So the higher transcendent purpose of the family, I agree, is not economic. It's to create citizens. And immigration is destructive of that end. There's an immigration myth that many of you here know, and some of you, unfortunately, believe, that any person can go anywhere and then belong to anything, as if people are infinitely transferable, people widgets, as I like to call them. It is a purely economic and ultimately reductive treatment of people. Whoever can perform a certain function better, who will work for less, who is willing to risk more, can and should be transplanted to wherever they're needed in the world. In many ways, this is the myth of the European Union itself. That all of you in this room could up and move to Copenhagen tomorrow, and voila, you're Danes. You would fit right in, is how the myth goes. And neither Hungary nor Denmark would be different because of the change. But this simply isn't true. This effort to erase the nation state, the soil of specific places, denies the fundamental reality, the anthropology, if you will, of the human person, that we are rooted in a place, that we are of a place. Humans aren't an ideation. We are living, breathing organisms. And we know this, or we ought to, as Christians or those who live in a Christian civilization. God entered into time and became a particular human person in a particular time, an inheritor of particular customs and of a particular law. That embodiment is also true of people today. We occupy a body and a time, a place, customs, languages in particular places. And so this is why we shouldn't just have children or have children to create economic widgets. We should have great and large families because families grow, shape, and mold citizens. They are the nation itself. It's the family where the nation is built, where its politics, its economics, its moral life are decided. And so this is why it's not enough to simply control the immigration flows from certain places or certain types of people. As I like to say with my friends, no one wants to be Ireland. In Ireland, they thought they had mastered immigration. They created a system of immigration control. But they allowed what they thought were high-performing, socially assimilable Chinese nationals, including originally dissidents from Hong Kong. They thought they were growing the high-skilled tech sector in Dublin. They thought they were obtaining Chinese investment in the Irish economy. And now, the Chinese nationalist population in Ireland is the fastest growing demographic in Ireland, more even than the Irish themselves. And Ireland has become something of a powder keg of Islamic nationalism and Chinese subterfuge. Or to break this down in a more direct way, I want to tell you the story of a particular American. Now, this American man grew up in a working class community in California, home of the great American dream. He was a journeyman carpenter. He learned a trade, and he learned it very well, and he became highly skilled as a carpenter. He married young, as we have all recommended here, and he had 2 children. He saved, and he bought a modest home. He paid his taxes, and he obeyed the laws. But his country allowed mass migration of immigrants into his community. They competed for jobs like his, for trade work. His children's schools were inundated with foreign nationals from all around the world. His neighborhood became subject to the very drive-by shootings described by Ms. McDonald, home invasions. And these immigrants were not as skilled, but they were willing to work for much less. This man ultimately lost his job. Then he lost his home. And then ultimately he lost his will. There was no immigrant diaspora coming to save this man. There was no Somalian Chamber of Commerce, no Filipino Small Business Council, no Mexican consulate he could appeal to for help. Let down by his own countrymen, he was left with spiritual despair and opioid addiction. In his death, this man, my father, became a statistic. Another white working-class American man who lacked, in Jeb Bush's words, the economic engine to succeed. Immigration saps the nation of its vitality and the energy necessary to drive into the future. It's work for other people. Those are jobs that are for them, not me. That's the task of other cultures. Mine is a privilege. That's the burden for them to bear. We're more rational. We don't have children anymore. All of this impoverishes the nation state. Not economic poverty, but a poverty of culture, a poverty of patriotism, of love of one's own fellow citizens. I cannot think of a more complete picture of this than the Muslim rape gangs in the United Kingdom. We now know that for decades, gangs of Muslim men in Britain were systematically raping and abusing young white British girls, including drugging them, kidnapping them, raping and torturing them, including by gangs of men at a single time. Now, obviously, the perpetrators of these crimes bear responsibility for them. But the circle of responsibility does not end with Muslim men. These girls, like my father, were let down, betrayed by their own countrymen. These girls were betrayed by their fellow Englishmen. They were deemed to be something else, something expendable, something excluded from the polity. And the men who abused them were considered something else too, left to their own predilections, allowed to carry on a subculture of sexual violence. And the British police, the prosecutors, and the politicians allowed all of this because the bonds of civil society had already been so ruptured through the forces of mass immigration that they no longer recognized their own responsibility for the vulnerable among them. They no longer recognized their responsibility to their own fellow citizens. Perhaps not rivers of blood, but certainly a quagmire of broken families and destroyed children. So this is what I'll end with here. Social cohesion is not inevitable. It can be maintained only through great effort, and it can be lost unwittingly. And once it is lost, it is nearly impossible to create again. I fear that my own country is in the position of needing to recreate social cohesion, and I hope we will succeed, though it is far from guaranteed that we will. And I hope that our American experience and the British experience and the experience of the rest of Western Europe in Sweden and Denmark and Norway might serve as a cautionary tale here in Hungary and anywhere else where there is yet time to make real change to immigration policy. Bolster the nation state, bolster patriotism, local culture, and, as Simone Weil said, rootedness. And doing so through the family, the oratory of virtue, of naturally oriented goodwill, will produce future citizens. Thank you.
So I just want to thank Danube Institute and Helen for the invitation for being here. I'll be focusing on two things. Specifically, I would say sort of the affectivity problem for why progressives pursue the immigration policies that they pursue. And then second, sort of what I see to be maybe the only possible solution for dealing with immigration in Europe and then in the United States. So on the affectivity sort of situation, Balázs Orbán sort of mentioned this earlier when he mentioned that attachment to home, country, people is not sort of the product of rational deliberation in the sense of like charts and graphs and statistics and things of that sort, but rather something that sort of develops almost instinctively, but it has to be trained and sort of promulgated and transferred from generation to generation because human beings are rational animals. So there's an interesting study that came out recently, and maybe people have seen this, and I think it perfectly encapsulates sort of the liberal soul, but it's the heat map of affectivity. Maybe people have seen this, but effectively you have 10 concentric circles, and each circle represents a different thing that you can put sort of affectivity points in. It shows your solicitude for the thing in the circle. And it starts from the things that are most proximate to you and extends all the way to the things most distant from you. So to give you how far this is, it starts with, I believe, family, goes to country, maybe extended relatives is between, but then it gets to like mammals, then it gets to insects. And at the very furthest end is space dust. And they asked different groups, they asked liberals, self-identifying liberals and self-identifying conservatives to place their affectivity points in the circles. And the heat map showed what is probably very obvious. The conservatives put, it was a big heat map circle around family, country, etc., and it decreased all the way to space dust. Most conservatives did not care that much about space dust. But the liberals, it had the exact inverse. They put all their points in space dust. The map shows decreasing intensity of affection in the reverse direction. So it goes from space dust, and there's almost none for family. It's the exact inverse. So if you're on, the Twitterverse, you'll see some leftists will make some point, and people just drop the heat map, and it's just your opinion has been disqualified because you clearly have a perverse and disordered affections. Now, how this manifests in, I think, reality is that if you have disordered affections, and this is coming from, I would say, the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, it actually is sort of a, how you could describe, disguised malice toward the things that you should actually have affection for. And so a lot of progressive policy can really just be understood as a disguised malice, and I think this explains a lot of the contradictions in how they express themselves. So at the same time that they say, we don't need family policy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they then complain that we don't have enough people, and then they need to import more people. When obviously the birth rate raising would solve the problem they purport to care about, but that's because they don't really care about the concerns of the people nearest to them. They have a sort of disguised malice for the things nearest to them for all sorts of philosophical contingent reasons, philosophical essential reasons. And so the affection is transferred to that which is least like them. And if you're in Europe or the United States, it becomes groups of people from some of the least developed places in the world with the highest crime rates, because that is sort of the opposite of what they have been accustomed to living in peaceful, prosperous, secure nations. Now, to extend this sort of thought process to the political frame, the left believes, and I think this is a centuries-long project, that their whole object is to liberate man from unjust hierarchies. And it's not relativistic. Pope Benedict XVI used to use this label, the dictatorship of relativism. But they actually do have very express, there is an aim, there's an anti-telos. They look at what appears to be the most natural institution, the most natural arrangement, contingent, political, etc. Those things which facilitate what has been defined in sort of the Catholic and then remaining in the Protestant traditions, elements of what makes society peaceful, prosperous, etc.
and they try to liberate man from whatever structures keep that in place and stable. And so I think there's an intellectual genealogy between sort of Enlightenment thought about, let's say, like the monarchical institutions, all the way even to progressive, liberating us from our own biology. And so how this goes is, well, nobles didn't earn the privilege of having the political power that they had back in the day, so we have to liberate ourselves from it. You go to the current place, well, I didn't choose the sex that I'm in, and so I have to liberate myself from this with this sacred contract with the state, and then through metaphysical alchemy, I become that which I sort of prefer to be. Now this extends to, how does this extend to illegal migration? Well, the same logic applies, and then combined with the malice makes it worse. But how it applies to the illegal immigration situation is they say, well, these people in Europe and these people in the United States were born in a place that they did not merit to be born in. They did not choose to be born here. And the people in these like violent, less developed, economically unstable, et cetera, just very unpleasant places, did not choose to be born here. And so it's unfair that these people were born here and these people were not born here. And so we will liberate man from this unjust hierarchy of affections, circumstances of birth and place, by importing these people, and it serves a dual function. It serves as liberating these people from this unjust hierarchy, and it also serves a sort of form of punishment for the people who have the privileges of being born in places other than the less developed countries, so to speak. And this tends to be the United States and Europe. And so when you're sort of arguing with these people, they sort of slide around different justifications for what they're doing, but I tend to think that these are merely pretextual justifications and that it's a deeper sort of hierarchy of malice, and as I described with the heat map, and a deeper desire to liberate man from natural hierarchies. So how do we sort of deal with this problem going forward? In the West, we're increasingly seeing what people call lawfare, and it's this lamentable phenomenon, but it's an inexorable phenomenon when you have a zero-sum conflict with competing understandings of the purpose of the state, the purpose of the polity, the purpose of law. If you have, a pre-modern telos, it's not going to mesh with a modern anti-telos. They're in complete and total conflict. And this gives rise to a problem which there's a professor in Harvard, Adrian Vermeule, talks about this a lot, but it's called the state of exception. You get to a situation where the justifying logic of how you understand the legal system is not working in the ordinary conventional way it's supposed to, because you're dealing with people you consider to be sort of, or situations that are outside of the contemplation of the law. And so you sort of see this with the lawfare against, European politicians trying to run for office, or you see this with what happened to Trump when he was getting constantly sued and prosecuted for various things. But it doesn't have the opposite side, and people say, well, this is hypocritical. It's not really hypocritical if you understand how leftists think about the purpose of the law. They believe that the sort of attempt by elements of society to restore order, I would say in a classical sense, is not the purpose of their understanding of the legal system. And so these people represent a dire threat to their understanding of the legal system and the polity. And so they enter into, whether acknowledged or not, usually not acknowledged because of the way our jurisprudence works, the state of exception. And so you become something akin to how Christians were defined in like the Roman era as like enemies of the human race. And so they're deprived of the benefit of conventional understandings of law because these elements represent existential threats to the order of the civilization that they're creating. And so if you sort of just apply this hierarchy of malice and this understanding of the state of exception and the purpose of laws, combine them together, it actually makes sense of a lot of the politics of progressives, and it also helps you understand why they make the sort of political arrangements that they make. So what do Islamist theocrats have in common with the LGBT lobby? You think, well, not that much. But when you get deeper, they both have a sort of foundational animus toward, I would say, Christian civilization. This is what unites them. And the leftists are, I think, they seem to be okay making this arrangement because they feel that Christian civilization is a deeper and more menacing enemy than even Islamists today. But I think this is what connects these two sort of elements, and you sort of look at the same thing in like the United States with like BLM and LGBT, not much in common except that they're civilizationally destructive. So that's how it works. Now, to look at immigration more U.S.-specific legal framework, but I'm sure sort of the ideas can translate to the European context, and it might have to do this in the future. But our Constitution actually kind of explicitly acknowledges something akin to a state of exception, and it's not called the Invasion Clause, but we'll call it that for now. But effectively, the U.S. Constitution grants state governors and the president the authority to declare an invasion. And once that happens, you convert a normally legal situation into a sort of military situation. Why this is very, very important is because, again, in the U.S. and Europe, in the U.S. in particular, as everyone is seeing, we're dealing with federal district court judges who are implementing the sort of legal philosophy that I just discussed to invalidate like everything President Trump is trying to accomplish, from mass illegal immigration to what links he's allowed to take off of websites for like government agencies. We actually have federal judges telling him he can't take down a link. I think it's unprecedented, like that level of granular detail. But this is sort of what he's dealing with. And so the current administration, for I believe the first time in U.S. history, declared an invasion at the southern border. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to sort of execute the mass immigration program through federal statutes, which unfortunately I don't have high hopes for the current United States Supreme Court to affirm what he's trying to do. It's just a depressing reality for our Supreme Court. And the sort of slew of federal judges, et cetera, are going to make this mass immigration deportation program very, very slow, onerous, and just extremely difficult. And so the way to get around this sort of conflicting visions of law is to turn to this state of exception, where you convert something that is a legal situation into a military situation and allows you conventionally to bypass the ordinary court judicial process. So with the invasion clause that has already been invoked by the president, I think in order to execute the mass immigration deportation program, he should draw out the implications of the legal doctrine that he has articulated, and he should, to the absolute best of his ability, avoid just the court system as he can. And this is because, and although this is not ideal for a civilization to have to undergo these sort of avenues, it might be the only way to do it for the reasons already mentioned, which is that we just have a zero-sum conflict between two competing visions of what the polity looks like, and that can only be resolved with one winner. There's no compromise position here because you have the space dust and the family priorities, and that affects every single decision that these people have. It affects every single emotion they have about any given subject. And I'll just leave it on just a good concrete example is you see sort of Trump showing how he's deporting, executing the program with like Homans doing interviews with like Dr. Phil, and they're on the ground doing their things, and you just look at the responses. You see, I would say, like well-adjusted Americans are saying, well, this is great. Finally, they're enforcing the law. But at the same time, you just look at the left, and it's just, this is literally fascism, which is just applying the ordinary federal statutes that currently exist. But I think if we understand leftists as not, like they're just not rational actors, and they have a perverse affectivity that animates their approach to reality, it will make it easier for us to sort of deal with them, one. And then two, understanding that we will almost certainly have to take unconventional legal avenues to dealing with the problems that we're facing because of the gridlock we face in all of our political systems. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Danube, for having me. As you can tell, I wasn't supposed to speak today, but yesterday. So thank you for making some space, and thank you for bearing with one more speaker this morning. You can think of me as the Hispanic quota of the American panel. So thank you very much. Now, obviously, Spain has a very different landscape to that of the US. Some common trends, though. So we, for example, we don't have a fathers issue. We don't have a race divide, say. We do have a children's problem, I think, because our fertility rate, I think yours is 1.8, you said, Mark? So ours is 1.12, okay? Yes, so the lowest in the EU, and I suppose in Europe, just after Malta. Well, the Vatican, yes, absolutely, the Vatican and Malta, I think. So we do have a problem, so much so that according to our statistics, Spain, without migration, and we will get into that, Spain will lose half its population before the end of the century. So I'm a father of 3 daughters. In their lifetimes, hopefully also mine, Spain will go from 48 to 26 or so million people. So we might as well have more children or import them. So at this point, who cares? Though we should care, because as Mark pointed out earlier today, there are both quantitative and qualitative aspects of migration we need to factor in. So, for example, as we know all too well at this point, and Spain's future is out of France, is today's France, actually. So migrants, especially the second generation, they tend to assimilate to the birth rates of the host population. So if we import 20 million people, say, we can expect to have an even larger problem by the end of the century. Also, the problem never stops by merely importing migrants. For example, I just told you Spain will lose half its population before the end of the century. Well, we need actually before 2053, so in 30 years, we need 25 more million people just to sustain our broken welfare state. So the welfare system is broken in Spain as well as in many, many other EU member states, and we do need, to bring over 25 million people. Again, Spain is 48 today, just to sustain it. Again, if they assimilate to the trends of the receiving country, the host country, we can expect to have an even, bigger problem down the line. So it's not about importing migrants. So from a quantitative point of view, that doesn't really work out. This is, and also from a qualitative standpoint, but again, this is not just about housing, well, things that obviously contribute to increasing birth rates, but this is not about housing, this is not about education, this is not about tax breaks, or not only about that. All of those, all of the above are, as it were, sufficient or necessary, but not sufficient conditions to increase birth rates. This is about really a civilizational survival instinct. Without that, you can be paid to have children, but you won't. As simply as that. You can have your life be a bit easier, materially wise, but you won't complicate yourself as much as to having children. So it's not just about money and tools that you're provided for. Although certainly that helps, because Spain, as many other countries, also including the US, has all of those: housing problem, job problems for young couples, a marriage epidemic. So more marriages are broken than made for decades now, etc. Also, going back to birth rates, if you discount the immigrants residing in Spain, you end up with 0.9. Okay, fertility rate. Okay, so there you have those. Now, when it comes to the qualitative aspects of migration, Spain over the past 3 decades has benefited from what I call the empire strikes back phenomenon, which in the case of Spain has been beneficial, especially if you compare it to the same phenomenon, again, the empire strikes back phenomenon of the UK and France, simply because Spain is much more capable of assimilating or accepting migrants from former territories or colonies, etc., however you want to call them, than these other European countries are. Spain is much more capable of accepting Peruvians or Argentinians or Mexicans or Guatemalans than the UK is doing the same with, Somalis or Pakistanis, or France is with Algerians, Senegalese, or migrants from Ivory Coast. Why? Because they are also called Jose or Juan. They speak Spanish. They are Catholics, at least culturally. They have their own traditions, etc. Anyway, that type of thing. There is one exception, though, which is in Catalonia, actually, which is an interesting exception because of the pro-independence movement. They, over the past 2 decades, have struggled and succeeded actually at this. They've imported non-Spanish-speaking population. Why? Because if you bring a Peruvian and you tell him or her to learn Catalan, they won't. They will stay in some other parts of Spain. However, if you bring a Moroccan or someone who is not speaking Spanish, they might as well just learn Catalan. So you have only Catalan-speaking people living in Catalonia, not Spanish-speaking people living in Catalonia. Now, that's proven to be a small problem for Catalonia. So much so that last week they formally asked the Spanish government, so the pro-independence parties have asked the Spanish government to please give Catalonia its own migration competencies. Not to accept more migrants, but to keep them out, okay? Because Catalonia, and now we get into crime, because I try to keep it brief, because now Catalonia is the region in Spain going under when it comes to crime rates. So actually, just to give you an example, over the past decade, the most common name of newborns in Catalonia has been Mohammed, with E, with A, with 2 M's, with 1 H, without it. So different iterations of the same name. They were in Spain for 700 years, so you can make the case that that's a perfectly okay Spanish name, but I would say it's not. Anyway, so all jokes aside, so they have now a crime problem. Now, obviously, the empire strikes phenomenon wasn't all good. We also imported some of their problems, as you always do. In this case, youth gang violence, okay, especially in Madrid, etc. But now Catalonia is said to, by virtually every security expert there is around, it will be the first city in Spain to have no-go zones, as it is the case in Paris, Brussels, or other European cities. because of Algerian drug gangs, because of Moroccan drug gangs, or arms dealing activities, etc. That type of thing. Now, Madrid will go under and will go deeper in this black pit. Why? Because by the time these gangs arrive to Madrid, which will be at the end of the decade, they will encounter competition. So rival gangs, in this case, from Hispanic America. I'm sorry, I refrained from naming it Latin America. There's nothing Latin about it. So Spain has a problem over the past decades, and really since 2006, Spain has been experiencing a new wave of migration coming from North Africa, from the Sahel region, directly to the Canary Islands in the Atlantic. So we've been accepting between 80 and 120,000 migrants from North Africa and the Sahel region each year. We also have a bit of a problem with Morocco and its use of migrants as weapons in this phenomenon of weaponized migration, which is not foreign to Europeans, because we've seen it in Turkey. Famously, Erdogan withheld or kept 3 million refugees in 2019 in exchange of 6 billion euros. Lukashenko in Belarus learns that lesson and also threatened the EU to be bribed, not to export those migrants. And Morocco has been doing the same thing, essentially, importing migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, the Sahel region in particular, and then putting them in the Moroccan-Spanish border, especially in the two cities Spain has in North Africa, which, they have a very grim future, I think. Anyway, so crime is rapidly growing. At the moment, there is a correlation between that type of migration and also the type and the crime rate, but also the type of criminality that's rapidly growing in Spain that we hadn't had in the past. So gang rapes, very violent crimes, etc. The Spanish population, the Spanish society wasn't used to that a decade ago, and that has come with migration. So, for example, the incarcerated population, from a migrant origin or migrant incarcerated population accounts to 37%, whereas they represent only 12% of the population. So again, there is an overrepresentation. Much more if you only look at these type of crimes. So we have that problem, certainly. But also, and I don't think this has been mentioned in this panel discussion, or maybe I was distracted, but also our law enforcement is not up for the task. So it still has tactics and gear from the 1980s and 1990s. So it's still thinking that crime is of a different type. Okay, and now gangs are better equipped. They have more, they're more tactical, etc. than they are. So they have a problem. They still live in an era which is in the 90s, for example, in Spain, when 90% of disputes or problems or fights were resolved by the mere presence of a police officer. Well, that's not the case anymore. Okay, so they need to improve considerably. So that's a very dark scenario. I'm sorry to say. Obviously, we need to strengthen our border control. It's not as easy as just building a wall, because we Spaniards happen to like our 8,000 kilometers of coastline. So we want to go to the beach. So you cannot just build a wall. And that's a problem for virtually every South European country. So if you have any ideas, apart from just sinking ships, let us know. You can always go, and it's proven to be successful so far, the Meloni route, by building building infrastructure, building capacity, creating jobs in origin countries, which are not really origin countries. They are transit countries for the most part in North Africa, especially Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, etc. But then again, what we need to do, I think, and Hungary has managed to do that very successfully, is to be able to answer the question of what is it of defining your own national identity, and what makes, a Spaniard, or what makes Spain, or what is Spain, right? Without that, how can we assimilate people if we don't have our own, a definition of our own? So how can we have a, tougher selection criteria if we are not able to define what is it to be a good British person, or a good Spaniard, or a good Hungarian, right? So they need to be assimilated into something, not into the nothingness. Otherwise, they might as well just keep their own, Beth culture or civilization. So I think that's a challenge for most Western countries. Again, Hungary has done the homework, but I don't think many other countries have done the same thing, and they should, together with, again, harsher and better law enforcement, border control, etc. So I leave it here. Thank you very much.
Overtime, but I think everyone really wants to hear the questions that Simon has prepared for our panelists. So I think perhaps let's go 10 more minutes for your roundtable, and then we can take a coffee break. And I did build some extra time into the schedule later on, so we should be able to accommodate this. We won't go too late today, and I'll keep the choo-choo trains running on time for the rest of the day. So.
You keep throwing the surprises at me. I'll be flexible. So I'll just start then and ask you to be as brief as you can. But for Heather, I know you had prepared remarks that we all enjoyed. But could you just very briefly sketch out any parallels you see between what's happened in Germany and the political shift in the past year and what happened in the U.S.?
Is this working? Yes. Well, Germany would love to have what happened in the U.S. They've got the power of the press that is unchallenged and have been able to basically squelch the rightful democratic representation of the Alternative for Deutschland. They have won the second most places in the last snap elections in Germany. 20% of the vote compared to, I think, 28% of the Merz's Christian Democratic Union Party. And yet, if you listen to the media coverage, they don't exist. And wherever they are, either in the majority or the near majority, they have been shut out of their parliamentary positions. In the parallel, I guess, with the United States is that it does represent a powerful popular demand to have their voices heard when it comes to migration and to a somewhat lesser extent the insanity of climate change policy. They're shutting down German industry in favor of totally unattainable, irrational climate goals. But the main issue is, as Mr. Orban said, does a culture have the right to say, we like the way we are, we do not want to change? We value our history, we value our social cohesion, and we do not want the inevitable massive demographic, economic, and cultural change that mass immigration brings in. The AfD has tried to articulate that position, and it has been labeled by definition racist and fascist by the other parties who are now creating wholly incoherent parliamentary coalitions in order to try and gain majorities It was supposed to be a sort of a conservative counter-revolution. Merz came in and said, I'm going to get the economy going again. I am going to enforce immigration. But in order to form a coalition, leaving out the Alternative for Deutschland means he has to bring the Greens back in. And so they've now demanded as a quid pro quo for raising the debt limit to spend more on defense, more climate change investments. I love the euphemism. So that is going on. We see in Europe just an extraordinary pushback. We've seen it with Marine Le Pen against the populist parties that are trying to give voice finally to a backlash to mass immigration. Trump has succeeded against all odds. I lost 4 stake bet dinners on the outcome of the election. I've paid 2 up at enormous cost. Got 2 more to go. I didn't think it would happen in the United States. I thought that the females were too dominant, and females in the United States are very left-wing, and I imagine they are in Europe as well. So it's the same, and yet Germany got blocked, and the U.S. at least found a path forward, and thanks to Theo in the government, we may actually make some progress. But let me just add, I guess the connection is crime. The situation in Germany is that crime is immigrant crime. They would have 0 crime without migrants. And it's like the taboo in the United States of talking about black crime. You may not talk about migrant crime. You may not talk, we're supposed to be feminist. You may not talk about gang rapes, mass rapes, because migrants are committing them. And therefore, we all go freaked out about white nationalism as if that's the threat in Germany. No, the threat is mass migration, whether it comes to national identity or national safety.
So on that, thank you very much, Heather. Just on that exact point, why do I get told by the Cato Institute and by people on the left that migrants commit lower rates of crime? Is that true?
It's not clear whether it's true or not, because we've looked at the data because our system is so distributed and states have an enormous amount of responsibility. The federal government can't really tell them what to do. The states are not created by the federal government. It's the opposite. And so it's actually not clear. We looked at Texas data specifically and actually critiqued one of their studies, and it does in fact seem that illegal immigrants do in fact have higher crime rates. But from my perspective, it doesn't even matter, because one crime committed by an illegal immigrant is one crime that never should have happened. So it's a sterile debate, and it's one of those, the only way to win the game is not to play the game. So we try not even to engage into that debate, because every person that the Biden administration illegally let into the United States who committed a crime, and a lot of them did, is one that shouldn't have happened, and the blood of those people is on the hands of those who crafted that policy, regardless of what the comparative crime rates are. It's utterly irrelevant, in my opinion.
Also, it depends on what the benchmark is. If you compare immigrant crime to blacks, it's much lower. If you compare it to whites, it's much higher. So the effect of immigration on a city's crime profile depends on the existing demographics. If it's immigrants moving into an all-white neighborhood, you're going to see gang crime go up. If you see immigrants moving into a black neighborhood like Compton in South Central Los Angeles, crime went down because then there was more economic activity. So we've got that issue in the United States.
Also, statistics can do miracles. So, for example, last year, the Spanish government regularized 500,000 illegal Moroccans, right? So every crime they commit, hereinafter
Is now Spanish crime.
Exactly.
Do you want to talk on this or something else? I know it's asking a lot, but I listened to your speech at NatCon, which is available on YouTube, and I wonder if you could just, in a minute or two, summarize this great experiment that you spoke about very eloquently.
So I was in the Oval Office once, and President Trump, after briefing the president, and the president said, "Wow, that's crazy, your idea. Why are you so radical?" And I said, "I'm from Stockton, California, sir. Stockton is the place of my birth. To give you some statistics, it was 72% white American in 1954. It became the first majority-minority city in America in 1982. There were 26 languages spoken in my kindergarten class. I've been jumped by every street gang imaginable. Filipino gangs, Hmong gangs, Laotian gangs, Vietnamese gangs, Cambodian gangs, Chinese gangs, Guatemalan, Honduran gangs, and Mexican gangs. Stockton is a part of a region of California. It feeds 1/5 of the world's people. We grow everything. You can stick anything in the ground and it'll grow. We produce about $7.4 billion worth of agricultural goods every year. And yet, if it was its own state in the United States, it would have the highest rates of teenage pregnancy, highest rates of communicable disease, lowest rates of literacy, lowest rates of high school and college graduation, and the lowest per capita income per household. It is essentially a living example of mass immigration. Every wave of immigrant population that has come into the United States after all of our foreign wars, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Hmongs, the Iraqis, the folks from Honduras and all of our covert wars in Central America, they've all been dumped in Stockton with no plan for cohesion, no shared language, no shared culture, no attempt at all to assimilate anyone or anybody. And the net result ultimately is incredible rates of crime. As we joke in my house, in Compton, they write rap songs because it's relatively safe and they have the leisure to do so. There are no rap songs about Stockton because there's too much crime. Okay, so the living example of this kind of community is social incohesion, it's violence, it's broken households, it's extremely high rates of drug use, all the other pathological, sociological behaviors, high rates of teenage pregnancy and the like as I described. It is essentially a nightmare dystopic place to live and to call home. And that's the future. That is the future without assimilation, without principles of law enforcement, and without sensible immigration controls. And the last thing I'll just say really quickly is to the point of the Empire Strikes Back. In classic Trumpian fashion, I've got a deal for you. We've got tens of millions of people in California. We'd be happy to send your way. Just give us some of those Sevillan oranges and some of that paella, and we'll trade you. All right?
Could I just get a word in about what has happened in California? And the reason I want to bring that up is that this past Monday, was what I have tried to get recognized as National Border Control Day, because it was Cesar Chavez's birthday. Cesar Chavez was the left-wing labor activist who started the United Farm Workers, and when I was young, he was, my dad would rail against these left-wingers and all this, but Cesar Chavez was a border hawk. If Cesar Chavez had gotten his way, much of what Theo was talking about never would have happened. And so the left has turned him, and this is a sort of microcosm of what they've done broadly, turned him into a kind of exemplar of open borders and race chauvinism, when he was in fact an immigration hawk and an anti-race chauvinist who actually said that the concept of La Raza, for those of you who are familiar with this, it's sort of this Hispanic chauvinist idea, is the Hitler concept. He actually said this. So I would just recommend nationalbordercontrolday.com. We actually have a website. We got a congressman to introduce a resolution to have it declared. This was several years ago. It didn't pass, obviously. And I've been trying to get the Trump administration, this seems like an obvious for President Trump. So if you end up anywhere in his vicinity, please push this for in 2027 will be his 100th birthday. So that would be an ideal thing for the president. Anyway, sorry.
And Daniel, if you could end on a hopeful note. You've been in Hungary for a while. Give us something positive to go out of this with.
I'll start with something negative, then positive. But just on the point about the crime rates and illegal immigration, I don't think it's a particularly material question. We're supposed to be securing the moral and material interests of our people, regardless of the positive advantages of other people. But at the same time, because of the heat map and the way liberals just think through issues, I just don't think that they would be importing so many people unless they had higher crime rates. Part of the purpose of mass immigration is to punish your own citizens and a sort of perverse mechanic of disordered affections. Positive. So we have sort of these different regimes that are emerging in what is the so-called post-liberal direction, which I would just say is like sane. But you have Hungary and you have sort of El Salvador sort of showing that you can improve your economic conditions, you can improve your demographic conditions, you can improve your moral conditions, etc., using means that are completely at our disposal. And the only thing that stands in the way is optics. So to the extent that you can bear the brunt of being called mean by leftists, you should be able to accomplish anything you want to accomplish in the West.
Thank you. And as they say to me on Newsmax 1, 30 seconds. Close this out.
Just, do what these folks say, please. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our panel.
If everyone could come and find your seat, I think we're going to go ahead and get this panel started shortly. Okay, wonderful. Welcome back, everyone. Okay, this panel is the one that, and I mean no offense to any of my other lovely panelists, but I must confess I was most excited about organizing this one because, we so rarely talk about the role of beauty and aesthetics in public life. And so to be able to bring together really, the foremost experts and insightful commentators on the subject is quite exciting for anybody who cares about things like that. So I would love to first introduce our moderator, who will be introducing the rest of the panelists, but this is Ashley Nerona. Oh, is John here? Oh. Her husband, John, is here, and also a panelist. But, okay, great. There he is. Hey, John. Anyway, I'll go ahead and introduce Ashley. Ashley is a professor of crisis communications and conflict resolution at various pontifical universities in Rome, Italy. She is the Rome correspondent for the Relevant Radio Network and was a Vatican official at the Pontifical Council for Social Communications at the Holy See. In 2017, Ashley and her husband John founded the Truth and Beauty Project, an initiative that creates educational programs dedicated to shaping minds and hearts through truth and authentic beauty to help form people who live lives pursuing virtue and excellence in all things, inspiring cultural renewal. Ashley, take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your warm welcome, Helen, and indeed it is such a joy to be able to speak about the important topic of aesthetics, of beauty in our lives. And this has been such an exceptional experience, being here with all of you and all of these great thinkers. So many kudos to the Danube Institute for your good work and these important conversations that we're having here. So I'm looking forward to make this foray into discussing aesthetics in public life. And it was Catherine the Great of Russia who said the words, "A great empire must be as beautiful as it is strong." And similarly, Emperor Franz Joseph said that Vienna must be a reflection of the grandeur and beauty of the empire. And I think for most of us, it's easy to relate to beautiful art and architecture. I had an experience, John and I, my husband and I, were in St. Peter's Basilica, and we were with a family of Juilliard-trained musicians. And before going in, they had this resistance. They said, "Oh, this is just opulence. What's this idolatry?" And we went in and we went deep into understanding the meaning behind the beauty. And when we left, one of the members of the family, she was just weeping. And she said, how can I go back to the real world after this? She said, everything's going to seem plastic. So we all have that ability to relate in some way to beautiful art and architecture and, of course, to nature. But it's interesting because today's topic, we're going to discuss aesthetics in public life. So as it relates also to politics and to policy. So beauty is not just an ornament to life. It's actually a fundamental aspect of civilization. And it shapes our sense of belonging. It shapes our moral sensibility, also our cultural continuity. And beauty has a profound role in sculpting the human spirit, as well as our public life. So again, to go back to Catherine the Great, who said, power without beauty is nothing but force. So on that note, I'm very happy to introduce you to our fine panelists. And I want to start by introducing you to Anthony O'Hare. Anthony is a British philosopher. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Buckingham, and he was the director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy and editor of the Journal of Philosophy from 1994 until 2019. He was the advisor to several UK governments on educational policy. So please join me in welcoming Anthony O'Hare. We're just going to rewind. So instead, allow me to introduce to you Dr. Jan Bentz. Jan was raised in Germany, and he graduated high school in St. Louis, Missouri, where he attended as a foreign exchange student. Dr. Bentz holds a doctorate in philosophy from the Roman Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum, a master's in sacred art, architecture, and liturgy, and a master's in church ecumenism and religious studies. His dissertation was published in German on Gustav Seewerth and his work on Thomas Aquinas and G.W.F. Hegel. His fields of expertise include metaphysics, history of philosophy, medieval philosophy, Thomism, and philosophy of art. He teaches for Blackfriars Studium and Memoria College out of the US, and he's a member of the board of Europa Aeterna, a political think tank for the German-speaking world. Let's welcome Dr. Jan Bentz.
So instead of getting highly distinguished Professor here, you get a lesser evil, which is me. So this is the fruit, what I'm going to talk about today is the fruit of a class that I taught in Rome, where I discovered my love for art and Western culture, which was a 45-hour American-style class. I gave a condensed version of that as a lecture in Oxford in 8 hours. As you know, the lectures are much shorter. I gave a brief talk last summer about this that lasts half an hour, and I have 10 minutes today. So I feel that next time I get invited to conference, I'm only allowed to say keywords. So having said that, today I want to give somewhat of a framework, maybe a philosophical framework for the discussion then that follows. Only slightly paraphrasing Dostoevsky, the awful thing is that beauty is mysterious as well as terrible. God and the devil are fighting there, and the battlefield is the heart of man. So, in an age of strip malls, brutalist ministries, algorithmic playlists, and therapeutic TikToks, the idea that beauty might matter in public life is often met with polite indifference or just a shrug. Beauty? Surely that's just a matter of taste, or perhaps a class signifier. But if you listen closely, a civilization that forgets beauty forgets how to live. So I want to begin by just explaining how beauty is really a significant bit and an essential bit of reality. It is not ornamental, but ontological. So it is not an aesthetic surplus or a mere aesthetic surplus to be enjoyed when serious matters like politics and policies and economics are settled. Rather, it is the radiance that makes truth visible, the form of the good rendered perceptible. Beauty lies in the fitting relationship of parts to a whole, bound by proportion, integrity, and radiance. In this way, beauty reveals the inner harmony of being. It is the language of metaphysical order. Now, modernity has relegated beauty to the subjective sphere, reducing it to individual taste and some preference. And this shift really has catastrophic consequences. It leaves the public sphere and the public square spiritually sterile, immune to transcendence, and blind to the formative role of beauty in human life. Worse, it elevates ugliness to a central role in the aesthetic endeavor and justifies it with the fallen state of man, ironically at the same time negating the truth of original sin. As Stephen Gross has argued, aesthetic experience is formative of perception itself. It shapes the horizons of what we think is possible, desirable, or even real. So where once the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, the complete work of art, drew all the senses into a unified moral and metaphysical vision, art today has become a victim and an accelerant even of fragmentation of the human experience. So let me start by something very briefly, which is this modern debate whether beauty is objective or subjective. Okay, let me just get that out of the way really quickly before we move on to more important things. That question itself somewhat is a symptom of the deeper fracture introduced by modernity, which is the artificial separation of object and subject. So I can sympathize, and I have been one of the people who have always looked for objectivity in beauty and the objective elements of beauty, and there are some objective elements of beauty, that's for sure. But to ask the question in that way is almost already a misguided venture, because it takes as a basis of thinking the modern separation of subject and object. So to ask whether beauty is in the thing or in the mind is already to have lost sight of the unity that characterizes pre-modern metaphysics. So for the classical and medieval thinkers, the human person is not an isolated observer, an isolated self projecting meaning into a meaningless world, but rather a participant in a reality that is intelligible and ordered and precedes the individual. In such a view, beauty is neither the projection of the subject nor a mere quality of the object, but a radiant harmony of being itself, revealed in the encounter between the two. So the subject recognizes beauty not by imposing form, but by being attuned to the form that already is. So beauty is not an abstract property to be verified, but a theophanic event, a disclosure of the real, and a disclosure of the unity of form and the intellect that is in tune with the unity of form. And the lack of perception of beauty is therefore the lack of being in tune with the unity of the form or reality, for that matter. So the question whether or not beauty is objective or subjective is not the right question. The question is, are we able to and capable of seeing it at all? So beauty, rightly understood, then draws the soul out of itself and into a participation with a higher order. It cultivates wonder, it disciplines the senses, and it draws the mind towards what is ultimately true. This is not accidental. This is how reality is designed to work. So beauty is not and neither the addition or the enemy of politics. It is the condition for their renewal. So this brings me to my second part, which is that most recent school that recognized that beauty is the condition for the renewal, but they had a very different renewal in mind, which is the Frankfurt School. So I could call it the long march through the galleries. The Marxist movement of the 68s, specifically I'm thinking of Theodor Adorno or Herbert Marcuse and other, who was very influential in the US, among other things, and other members of the Frankfurt School argued that a true revolution must be aesthetic. It must shape how people perceive reality itself. Marcuse insisted that liberation must begin in the imagination, in that kind of imagination space where you form your ideals and where you think about what is truly possible. So because beauty as form and tradition was deemed repressive, art had to become disruptive, anti-formal, deconstructivist, and anti-hierarchical. This vision gained traction in universities and art institutions first, and then replaced slowly skill contemplation with critique and craftsmanship with commentary. So today we live somewhat in the wake of this aesthetic revolution, and we see the outcomes of it. You can Google, and there's some videos about this, how the Open Society Foundation, for example, actively funds art projects that explicitly aim to reshape social consciousness, to disrupt society, and to challenge traditional norms. So art here is not for art's sake. Art should not be for art's sake. Art should be for beauty's sake. But art is for political sake. Art becomes a tool of ideological engineering. So beauty, if it is talked about at all, which most of the time it is not, is suspect because it suggests order and a metaphysical reality that stands above the self. And in that sense, the 1968 program has been successful and has shown us, or has in fact manifested, how art is no longer the window to the transcendent, but a mirror of activist ideology. So, I don't want to remain too much in the theoretical, even though I'm a philosopher. I can do this for hours, and I'm sure that we're going to deepen in the discussion, but I do want to suggest somewhat a return to form and be also a little bit more practical. So, I would argue that the dissolution of form, and thus the dissolution of beauty, reflects the last act of metaphysical despair. A world and a society which is unable to symbolize meaning because it does not longer believe that meaning is possible. So if the crisis of our culture is at the root a crisis of beauty, then its renewal must also initiate with beauty. We must recover the conviction that beauty is not a decoration, but a disclosure, that it, as I said, reveals truth in form. So artists then are not entertainers or even ideologues, but they're midwives of reality. How do we go about this rediscovery? I think it goes somewhat along the lines of relearning, first of all, the objective criteria for beauty, so unity, proportion, and radiance, which are not arbitrary, and they can be scientifically proven. And then ultimately, we need to see that beauty is rooted in the structure of being itself, and thus in something transcendent. Now, me as a Catholic, I can say it's rooted in the Trinitarian God, who is beauty, truth, and goodness in perfect harmony, and that's obviously most visible in the Incarnation. But we can speak more generally, more philosophically, and just show that beauty shows and reveals the other transcendentals. So we must reject this nihilism of creative creation or even creative destruction, and reaffirm the goodness of form, of tradition, and of craftsmanship. Artistic making is not primarily a matter of self-expression. We can all express ourselves. That does not make us artists. It is a matter of skill, of dedication, of insight, of ideas, of reflection, of imagination, and of forming matter, of informing matter. So the artist and the audience must learn to receive beauty, to make beauty, and to return to the form what is true and good. And this is the moment when the artistic and the aesthetic imagination becomes moral and thus important for civilization. So there's a couple of concrete practices that I would suggest, again, to not stay all philosophical. The first and the most kind of obvious maybe, but also I feel the most forgotten, is patronage. Beauty needs patrons. Okay, the Renaissance would not have happened without the Medicis. The same is true for modern institutions. The first thing that you can do and that you ought to do as an institution is support artists, to support good art studios. Once artists realize that there's a market for true and for good, for beautiful figurative painting, for example, or even for icons or religious art, then they will learn those things. If there's no market, then all artists, which are struggling for survival anyways, they will not really endeavor and go out to learn these very difficult skills and styles. So, fund a chapel, commission a sacred icon, support a school of craftsmanship, or pick an artist that you like and buy his works, and they can be oftentimes much cheaper than what you imagine. I know people who are maybe autodidacts in drawing or in painting, in oil painting on aquarelle, and you can buy paintings for a couple of $100 or a couple of €100 or pounds. So this is not a great investment, but it's a small step to keep an artist, a good artist, alive. The second is the artisan revival. So we have to discover the dignity of the craft. Okay, idealism, rationalism in general, which is kind of the ailment of modernity and at the root of everything, I would argue, that's a different conversation, we can have over coffee, it devalues the craftsmanship of working with matter. It has a somewhat disintegrated aversion to matter and anything material, which is lower, it's dark, it's lightless and lifeless. But we need to support and learn again the traditional way of the art. So wood carving, stone masonry, even illuminated manuscripts. So support those apprenticeships, and we need to train those new generations in technical skill, not just in the metaphysical ideas, but in actually making it, in learning it, in doing it. So that brings me to the next point, which is education. We need to restore the centrality of beauty in the curriculum, and I think this is really one of the most effective means to bequeath this appreciation of beauty to the next generation. It starts in the family, obviously, but it has to also resonate in schools, even in kindergarten and so forth. So you need to learn how to behold what is noble, what is harmonious, what is luminous, what is beautiful. This is how we can re-enchant the liberal arts. Ultimately, we also have to give a cultural witness. So artists and thinkers alike must refuse the pressure to produce political commentary disguised as art. They must instead bear witness to what is beautiful and try to find that beauty and express that beauty. Not a retreat from the world, but a re-entry into it, but on a higher ground or on the more profound ground, depending on how you want to look at it. And this really is done by personal education. Dedicate time is one of the first things that I tell my students. Sit down and listen to one movement of one symphony that you like, of your favorite composer. Oh, you don't have a favorite composer. Okay, listen to Beethoven. Okay, listen to one movement of the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven. And you would be surprised how few of my students have actually ever done that in their life. Okay, it's 15 minutes. And I have never had a student complain that there was wasted time. They may have said, I don't really like Beethoven, but it may have, brought up their interest in seeking for another composer that they may prefer to, let's say Beethoven. So dedicate time, dedicate space, and also dedicate resources to it, dedicate money to it. As I said, support an artist, buy a good recording of a classical symphony, listen to it, and maybe even compare it. It's like a good wine tasting. Listen to the same symphony, for example, by different conductors, and you'll learn something about it. As if you have a wine tasting, you'll learn something about wine by comparing it right next to each other. So beauty then, as Dostoevsky foresaw, is not safe. It is dangerous. It lays claim to the soul, and it demands a response. So let us respond with form, with craft, and with lives ordered towards the splendor of truth, and by doing that, beauty will convince through itself. Thank you very much.
And you already got a little sneak peek into the background of Anthony O'Hare. And with that, I invite you to the podium, and let's welcome Anthony O'Hare.
Thank you. I wanted Jan to go first so he could say some things that I wouldn't then need to say. So I'm going to begin by reading a short passage from Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa has been turned into a cockroach or a beetle, but he's in his family home and he's listening to his sister playing the violin. And yet his sister played so beautifully. Her face was turned to the side, intently and sadly following the notes on the page. Gregor crept forward a little further, keeping his head near to the ground so that his eyes could meet hers. How could he be a brute beast if music could make him feel like this? So, music can make us feel like this. It can elevate us. C.S. Lewis, not talking about music, but about other forms of, about poetic beauty, said that good poetry tuned me up to a higher pitch. Michelangelo, of course, first of all the sculptor, but also a painter and a poet, in one of his poems, which I thoroughly recommend to you, he says, some of these poems are very angry actually, but anyway, he says, "When my rough hammer transfigures stone into the shape of human beings, it would be powerless to create anything without a master to guide its blows. There resides, in the hammer of God, a mighty force that gives delight to the world." So Michelangelo is expressing very beautifully there the view, which I have a lot of sympathy with, that the great or the inspired artist is inspired and inspired by something from above. However, to explore this a bit further, does all music, or all poetry, or all so-called poetry, or all art do this, tune us up to a higher pitch? Can it be seen as us in the hands of the hammer of God, our hammer in the hammer of God? There is, of course, as we know only too well, music which degrades, which is violent, mechanistic, misogynistic. There is also self-indulgently sentimental, self-pitying, again, mechanistic music, which I think most pop music is, if it isn't violent. If you go into any modern art gallery, you'll find mostly nihilistic agitprop of unbelievable superficiality and stupidity. Now, so I'm not advocating all or any forms of art. Matthew Arnold, in one of his essays on criticism, says that this line, which I'm going to quote, is the touchstone of great poetry. And the line is this from Dante: "En la sua volontade è nostra pace." In his will is our peace. Now, this is uttered by Picarda, who was a nun who broke her vows, but nevertheless led a good life and is in the first sphere of heaven. But what is God's will, according to Dante? Well, we know from the end of Paradiso that it's the love that moves the sun and the other stars. But we also know this from Dante's Inferno. Over the gates of hell, there is an inscription, and two lines from the inscription say, "Fecemi la divina potestà, la somma sapienza e il primo amore." So I was made by the divine power, the supreme wisdom, and the first love. So the first love made hell. Just think about it. A difficult saying, but one that might lead us to question the shallow sentimentality of, I'm now going to refer to P.G. Wodehouse, who I think is often a very insightful writer, Madeline Bassett, the rather annoyingly wimpish woman who tries to capture Bertie Wooster, says, "Oh, Bertie, don't you believe that the stars are God's daisy chain?" I think he was right on target there. You might not like hell or the idea of hell, but if beauty is to be more than God's daisy chain, it has to encompass the reality of evil and suffering, malevolence, and so on. In Fantastes, an almost unreadable book, but one much by George MacDonald, but much admired by C.S. Lewis, MacDonald says, "Joy cannot unfold the deepest truths, although the deepest truth must be deepest joy." I think that there is always, or almost inevitably, the shadow of darkness in true or deeper beauty. And having mentioned Michelangelo, I will refer you to Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the wall of the Sistine Chapel, not the ceiling. And he painted this quite a long time after the ceiling. And in the Last Judgment, Christ is a terrifying figure. Actually, when you go there, he absolutely dominates the chapel. When you see a reproduction, the Christ is only about twice as big as the other many figures in the Last Judgment, but nevertheless, it absolutely overpowers you. And this figure of Christ is casting sinners into hell predominantly, and Michelangelo himself portrays himself in the flayed skin of St. Barnabas. This, I think, is an overpowering work of art. A few years ago, I was in the Festival Hall in London, listening to the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, conducted by the great Maurice Janssens. And they played Shostakovich's 10th Symphony. And in the second movement of this symphony, I thought to myself, this is so horrible. Why am I sitting here listening to this? This was Shostakovich at his most formidable, rhythmic, discordant, hammer-beating, terrifying score. Why am I listening to this? Of course, I've been criticized for saying it was so horrible, but that's certainly how I felt it. However, after the 10th Symphony, what did Maurice Janssens play as an encore? Unbelievable. He played the transformation scene from Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty. The scene in which the prince is led by the lilac fairy from above to redeem the world that has been cursed by the other fairies. Note the lilac fairy comes from above. Would Shostakovich have approved of this encore? Well, of course, I don't know. I've no idea. But Shostakovich, in one of his greatest and most powerful and most powerfully, in a way, threatening works, he composed it just before he died, was on music to the poems of Michelangelo. And he sets some very bleak poems of Michelangelo in this, including actually the one about the hammering. That's a fantastic piece. You really ought to listen to this if you can. There's a very good recording by the great Russian bass Horostovsky. One of the main, he quotes two poems of Michelangelo about Dante. Dante being the greatest man who ever lived, but who'd been exiled by his own city, which many people think was by Shostakovich, who was obviously an admirer of Michelangelo and probably of Dante. Michelangelo knew most of Dante by heart. But this setting by Shostakovich is a reference to the exile of Solzhenitsyn and Rostropovich from Russia. And there is, of course, a poem, one of the poems about death, in which Michelangelo is terrified of death. A double death, he says, comes near. The one is sure, the other a threat. That's hell. And Michelangelo says, painting and sculpture cannot any more quieten the soul that turns to God again, to God who on the cross for us was set. However, at the end of these very bleak poems, Shostakovich sets a poem about how the artist will live on in the appreciation and experience of listeners, viewers, and so on. And the music Shostakovich uses for this is a very almost trivial little piece that he composed himself when he was a child. So after this bleakest music that Shostakovich could possibly write, he has this, in a way, comforting and almost childlike ending. So what I want to say, before I just come to a conclusion, is that art, if it is deep and if it is on the right track, can inspire us to the highest thoughts, intimations of transcendence, and so on. What has all this, though, got to do with the family, which we're supposed to be talking about? I'm not quite sure what my brief was, but anyway, I think it's got everything and nothing to do with the family. I think that in the family, a respect for beauty should be cultivated in the way that Jan has suggested. And like Plato and Aristotle, and the Greeks, the classical Greeks generally, I think that an education in music and gymnastic, but I'm talking here about an education in music, should precede education in dialectic, reasoning, and mathematics. By music, they mean things to do with the muses. So it includes music, poetry, song, drama, history. Why must these things be cultivated in the young first? Because they can't reason, but they need to have their emotions and their values and their tastes put on the right lines. So they come, I'm going to be very Aristotelian now, they come to feel shame where shame is appropriate. Shame. They honour and love what is honourable. They recognize their debts to those before them and their duties to the city and also to the future. And I think that an education in music can inspire in young people these right feelings, these right emotions. Of course, it isn't guaranteed. The individual person is a free person and may not act according to these things. And Alcibiades, who knew all this as well as anybody, actually behaved disgracefully. But still, he still said that talking to Socrates was the best thing that ever happened to him. Still, anyway, but my worry is that too many parents in this area are passive and indecisive, and they accede too easily to the degradations which we see all too commonly in popular culture. And they give their children, none of the works or the music which could set them on a better path away from the brute beasts. And I would also castigate the general dogmata of modern education that wants, it seems to me, almost deliberately to keep children away from the great works. Great is not allowed anyway, but the great works, particularly the great works of the past, particularly if they're written or painted by white men like Michelangelo. So what do I suggest we do as parents? Well, I'm not by any means completely pessimistic. I took my grandson with my other, the 5-year-old grandson, to the Van Gogh exhibition recently in London. And he was entranced, and he did something that normally I would have been extremely annoyed about. He grabbed my wife's telephone and started taking photographs of the pictures of Michelangelo, Van Gogh, that he really liked. So he's now got his own collection of 8 Van Gogh paintings. My own son, when he was about 7, was entranced by Shakespeare's Henry V, and he used to quote the St. Crispin's Day speech, the whole thing. Now, you might say that Henry V is a slightly equivocal figure, but nevertheless, reading and being immersed in Henry V inculcates in somebody who reads that speech, loves that speech, in virtues of heroism, duty, self-sacrifice, and so on. I would say that you could give young children the Alice in Wonderland, Wind in the Willows, Swallows and Amazons, lots of books that are not only fascinating, but also inculcate sound values. I would also introduce them to the mythologies of Greece and Rome and other great cultures. And they could go on, and no doubt they would read C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and I would say J.K. Rowling, who I don't despise at all. Music, yes. You could get them to listen to Mozart and Handel, let's say. And then they might later on move into the sublime worlds of Beethoven and Bach, and well, you could give them Schubert as well. So I think, particularly with, and this now refers to education, particularly with children from, what you might call deprived homes, they will never meet any of these things in school. At home. They will never meet any of these things at home, so it's all the more imperative that they're given them in school, and the schools don't track down to what they think are fodder fit for basically the lower orders.
And I'm delighted to introduce our third panelist today. John Noronha is a professor in Rome. See, I know exactly how to pronounce his last name because it happens to be mine too. He teaches a variety of subjects like sacred art and architecture, bioethics, technology, and theology at various universities. He has master's degrees in electronics and telecommunications engineering, as well as theology, philosophy, the thought of Ratzinger, Augustinian studies, and in computer engineering and information systems. He's a doctoral candidate in bioethics. John was the head of future technology initiatives for Verizon Global Communications in the US before transitioning to the humanities. John serves as a consultant in various capacities, including for the Vatican when the Pope appointed him to the Papal Reform Commission with the task of investigating the Holy See's need for organizational, financial, and strategic reform of the Vatican. He's the co-founder of the Truth in Beauty Project. And I have to add that since, of course, our topic is family, I can say that after 17 years of qualitative analytical research, he's also a great husband.
Thank you, Ashley. It's delightful to be here. Speaking of beauty, this is beautiful. The conference, the setting, everyone who's doing such wonderful things in your own spheres. So it's wonderful to be here, and especially in this capacity because, as Ashley mentioned, I was in the world of technology. And as an engineer, beauty wasn't even on the radar. It wasn't even on the periphery. Everything had to be functional, and if it worked, it didn't matter how beautiful or ugly it was. All that mattered was its functionality. So eventually, after having what I call a conversion to the world of beauty and art, for me, what was most important was to find a way to see the humanities like philosophy and anthropology and sacred art and other things through an engineering lens. So everything had to be logical, everything had to be connected. And so even in context of beauty, the question for me was, well, what is beauty? Is it only one-dimensional? And Jan and Professor Anthony have done a wonderful job in explaining the scope. And so the beauty of going last is I get to kind of join that and sum up the dots and put everything together. So beauty, if you look at it in all its dimensions, so One of the very important dimensions that's often not talked about is the metaphysical, which Jan mentioned. So it's just beautiful to be alive in whatever capacity of life that is. Well, if a thing is living, is in being, then what is the nature of that thing, and what, based on the nature, that's what caused its flourishing or fulfillment. Well, then you have so many other kinds of beauty, like moral beauty. There's so much beauty in doing the right thing at the right time, and virtue is the habitual disposition to do it always without any struggle. It just comes with ease. That is something so beautiful. And actually, then you have personal beauty. So I can affirm that in Ashley too, because it's not just the external beauty of a person, but it's that inner beauty that radiates forth even in the absence of what is called objective beauty that is out there in fashion shows and things. So to tell you a little story, so Mother Teresa, she wouldn't be, especially in her last few years, wouldn't be considered to be the most objectively beautiful person. But there was a time when a very anti-Christian, a very powerful political figure, took a group of not only politicians, but also the media with him, and he went to one of Mother Teresa's centers for the destitute people. And he went there and he was yelling and screaming in her face. He even spat at her. And he told her that this is really not doing much. He said, you only have about 100 young people over here. What about the millions on the streets of India? She didn't say anything to him, but she just walked away into the center. And what she did with everyone following her was went to each of the beds and said, I would like to introduce you to Toby and Kiran and Ali, name after name. They had tears, and it actually even chokes me up whenever I talk about this because it's so moving. She said, I may not make a difference to millions, but I made a difference to each one of these individuals. And that's a kind of beauty that hardly anyone really thinks about, the beauty of charity, the beauty of self-giving and sacrifice. So then if you take it to spiritual beauty, that's a whole nother mystical level. So we can talk about the beauty of the unfathomable Trinity from a Christian perspective. We can talk about the beauty of the Incarnation, the Paschal Mystery, and all of this. And so these are so many different forms of beauty. But then for me as an engineer, things also have to be practical. And so I wanted to kind of give you a little example of how things can be practical, because in its highest sense, if we consider what is considered to be one of the definitions of beauty, that which when sensed or perceived causes happiness or at the highest level delight. So in that sense, when we talk about beauty in the highest sense, it's both relative, but also it is a mystery. And the reason I say it's relative, because to quote what someone in Rome said to the Corinthians, he said, now we see things dimly as in a first century Corinthian mirror. But then, eventually, that's the height of our fulfillment. We will see him as he is, face to face, as the psalmist says in Psalm 27, verse 4. All I ask, and this I seek, is to dwell in the house of the Lord and to gaze upon the beauty of his face. So that is the highest form of beauty which we all hope and dream for. I wrote this I wanted to have a poetic way of saying this, so this is just a little quick. Vanity of vanities, the sages say, the state of affairs in the world today. But hope abounds through divine grace that we shall see him face to face. But now beauty in the public sphere, which is a topic that we are trying to figure out how we can actually really bring this to have a practical sense, because very often beauty is spoken about in a very abstract sense. There's power of beauty in this and that, but the question is how to really give you an experience of this. And since I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, you can either bring it up on your phones or if you already know it, then from your memory and imagination. So I want to bring to your mind Rubens's beautiful Baroque depiction of Prometheus. And I also want to demonstrate how knowledge, which both the speakers talked about, is so helpful in taking the same experience to a whole new level. So let's say someone just saw, from a purely aesthetic point of view, Rubens's Prometheus. You have him chained, and what else do you think you're going to see in that encounter, for those of you who know it? You have the eagle, and what's the eagle doing? Yeah, eating his liver. Yeah, so if you didn't know what's going on, you would just be so wowed just from an aesthetic sense. Now, let's say you knew what the story of Prometheus is about. Well, that would take it to a whole new level of meaning. And you see how Prometheus is willing to go through this aspect of sacrifice his own good just for the sake of the human race. When it's thanks to him that he's not only the patron of fire, but also the arts, giving us science and the arts. Well, but then if you take it to a whole new level of seeing Christian symbolism in it. So for those of you who know your art history symbols, the eagle is a symbol of which evangelist? John the Evangelist. And then in John chapter 6, does he mention anything about eating flesh? He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood lives in me and I in him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Well then, it's fire that Prometheus brought to us. Well, did the person who is raising us up on the last day promise us a gift which will lead us to eternal life through tongues of fire? So by analogy, something that's just a work of beautiful aesthetic art can have a whole new sense of meaning and lead us to a sense of fulfillment. So now if we take the context of beauty from an Aristotelian context, so let's go through the four causes. So the efficient cause, of course, would be the artist, whoever it is. The material cause, whatever is used. And then you have the formal cause, describing the thing for what it is. But it's a final cause, which is the most important, because in Kantian's critique, he said it has to be disinterested, which I think is very interesting, because if anyone creates or evaluates art just from a point of view of what is this going to do for me in terms of wealth or fame or legacy, then that wouldn't be the end point of this whole project of art. But if it is art that leads to the development of virtue, self-giving sacrifice and love, especially for the highest causes, then that's the final cause that's really this ripple effect that can transform human society. So we see the power of art. So if we talk about public policy from, let's say, a national or a state level, well, we hope and pray that we have good leaders who actually care about this and who know what good art is. And we've already heard what makes art and aesthetics good, pleasing, and wholesome. But this is not always in our control. So what is in our control is what both the speakers talked about, is creating an environment which is helping to develop all the skills of recognizing how to glean what would be helpful for us in our own lives, in bettering our own lives. So, for example, another practical thing to think about, the depiction of David and Goliath. Three great versions of this. Michelangelo's in Florence, and then you have Bernini's David and Goliath. And then eventually think of Titian's David and Goliath. So just bring it up if you can quickly on your phone. And you see how from Michelangelo's David, you see the sense of calmness, you see the sense of confidence. So this is what Florence wanted, especially at a time when they were just kind of getting out of their own kind of this sense of not being secure. And now suddenly they have this pride and confidence that they can overcome anything. Well, one little thing you will see at the foot of Michelangelo is a little stump. And very often, art historians will say, oh, yeah, that's used to balance the other foot. Well, that actually, taking it to a whole new spiritual level, is from Isaiah chapter 11. You'll see the same stump in the Pietà. You will see it in the Sistine Chapel in the creation of Eve, in the fall. This is something that is so much a part of Michelangelo's idea of hope. From Isaiah chapter 11, a shoot from the stump of Jesse will rise up. And this is what we are trying to do over here. A shoot from the stump of Hungary, let's say, will rise up and then redeem the whole world. But then if we think of Bernini, you see something with action, intensity, conviction. Nothing's going to stop David. And that can be inspiring. And then you look at Titian's. And with that, if you read from 1 Samuel 17 and think about how this Philistine giant, Goliath, was taunting them for 40 days. It wasn't the tall and handsome eldest brother of David, Eliab, nor Abinadab, but it was David, the youngest one, who was able to go against Goliath. And he says to Goliath, you come to me with a spear, a javelin, and a sword, but I come to you in the name of the Lord. And that's the spirit we should have, no matter, because now if we personalize it, who in our lives or spheres is the Philistine? Who is the Goliath? Who is so powerful in all ways that we feel like we have absolutely no hope, just as the Israelites just fled in fear. But we have the power, because if we know that our power comes from the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth, then that's enough to give us the hope that we need. And then if we think about Titian's depiction, so it's not in the act of slaying Goliath, it is giving thanks to God for our lives, for our gifts, for everything that we have. So rather than be in a spirit of woe is me, it's like I thank God in the spirit of true Aristotelian piety, that respect for parents and our countries that have given us so much. And from this, we can actually see how we can learn, if it's two things that we have to take away from that in terms of virtues, faith and fortitude. The idea of believing in something that's not always perceptible, but then having the courage to do the right thing. I can only imagine if you were to see Caravaggio's depiction, well, that can give us a whole new sense of self-introspection, because for Caravaggio, he used his self-portrait, but not in the face of David. It's in the slain head of Goliath. And this is because we can see a whole new aspect of the David and Goliath story through this, because often, especially when we think about activism and changing the world and everything, we always think about doing things for others. But we don't think of the fact that David was both an adulterer and then a murderer. And eventually, what makes David so great as an example is his contrite heart. Psalm 51. Create in me a new heart, O Lord, and the right spirit within me. And so with Caravaggio's David, the question for us would be, what is it in me that I need to change? Because just as the song written by, I think it's Jill something Miller, it's not activism just to change the world, but we change the world by letting it begin with me. What's the song? Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. And so in conclusion, it's just so wonderful to think about the immense power of beauty and the arts. And if only we can harness it in all these different ways, subsidiarity, solidarity, and everything, then helping people see how art can be used both in public policy and then in the family, that's where the difference is truly made. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to our three distinguished panelists. And thank you very much to the Danube Institute for promoting these conversations. And I invite you to continue the conversation going with our panelists because we're right up against the wire for you all to go to have lunch. So please do, during this time, continue to chat and ask questions. And in the meantime, as we say in Italy, buon appetito. Enjoy your lunch.